Francisco Franco, absolute ruler over Spain, was one of the most enigmatic dictators in European history. Even today, the country still bears the scars of his reign.
But one of his soldiers, in fact, mocked him when he gave an order, and Franco promptly pulled out his pistol and shot him dead.
He seized power in a bloody civil war and ruled the country with an iron hand for 40 years.
He once said, "I'd have no problem killing half of Spain just to stop it becoming Marxist."
A despot not even his trusted followers could really see through. A man with many faces.
Franco in private, when he was with, I say, friends, if one could call them that, was an absolute blabbermouth. You couldn't shut him up. You know, and of course, once he was in power, no one dared to shut him up.
In 1975, following Franco's death, Spain was a divided country, the legacy of a dictator full of enigmas. But who exactly was this Francisco Franco? In 1936, political unrest plunged the country into chaos, and a great opportunity presented itself for a man whose career seemed to have run its course a long time ago. General Franco instigated a coup which led to a bloody civil war. With the help of Nazi Germany, Franco's troops murdered their way to power. Hitler's air force, the Luftwaffe, used Spain as training for his war of extermination. When hostilities finally ceased, Franco declared himself the new head of state. No one dared contradict the new authoritarian leader, apart, that is, from his dominant wife. She would survive the despot. For more than a century, Spain had ruled the waves as the first superpower of the modern era. But in 1898, in the war against the emerging United States, the Spanish fleet was almost totally destroyed. Spain's naval supremacy was over. The empire crumbled as more and more colonies fought for independence. A once so proud country of discoverers and conquerors slid into military and economic insignificance. A humiliating decline for Spanish self-esteem.
It was a traumatic experience for Spanish society, for its elites, and above all for the establishment. For the armed forces too, especially the Navy.
El Ferrol, on the Atlantic coast, had once been an important military base. It was here, 7 years before the Spanish fleet was annihilated, that Francisco Franco Baumonde was born, the second of 2 children in an officer's family.
As a child on the dockside at El Ferrol, he would have seen the boats arrive, he would have seen the dead being taken off the boats, he would have seen the wounded and the cripples coming up. And this had a tremendous impact on the rest of his life.
The boy grew up in the everyday life of a garrison town, where members of the Navy were a natural part of the scene.
Franco lived in a small, secluded milieu in this garrison town, on the naval base at El Ferrol.
Prior to the defeat in 1898, it was still possible for members of a naval family to believe that they belonged to a great nation with a great navy that was important in the world. And after 1898, it was no longer possible to think that.
A shy boy, Francisco was just an average pupil. He had a strict Catholic upbringing, but his father earned a reputation for being a man about town.
He had a very domineering mother, and he also had a father who was not very present. So I think it's reasonable to suppose that his was not already a happy childhood.
Spain was faced with huge problems. Whereas other countries had long since placed their faith in industrialization, Spain was left lagging behind the modern era. Most of the farmland belonged to big landowners. The gap between rich and poor was growing ever wider.
Ein weiter Teil der spanischen Bevölkerung lebt vom
A large proportion of the Spanish population lived on the land, but under the miserable conditions of day laborers.
Lebensumständen als Tagelöhner.
King Alfonso XIII could not get a grip of the problems. Corruption flourished, while strikes and revolts paralyzed the country. In Catalonia and the Basque Country in particular, calls for independence grew louder. The decline of the Spanish Navy shattered Franco's career dream. It now required very few recruits and took only the best. Franco was turned down. All that remained open to him was the infantry, in the form of the military academy in Toledo.
You know, he was a child when he went to it, and he was, in a way, younger than his age. You know, he was tiny. I think he must have been very unhappy in the military academy.
When unrest broke out in Morocco, Spain was even in danger of losing its last colony. The military was called on to restore order. Franco joined the mission to Africa. When ridiculed by his colleagues for his lack of height, he was only 1.63 meters tall, he reacted with demonstrative severity.
Franco's sister, for instance, once told how he had pressed a red-hot needle down on his wrist. His only comment was that burned flesh smells abominably.
For me, somebody who does not know fear has got serious personality deficiencies. So, yes, Franco probably didn't know fear.
The Morocco mission was characterized by massive brutality. Prisoners on both sides were badly treated. It was on the colonial battlefield that Franco made his mark. At the age of 22, he became the youngest captain in the Spanish army. His hallmark was rigid discipline.
One of the things I think that distinguished him at this time is precisely because he had virtually no interest in sex, he didn't drink, and so while a lot of his colleagues and companions and comrades were coming to terms with the very harsh conditions, with drink, with gambling, with prostitutes, he didn't do any of that.
Instead, Franco spent nights studying maps and planning attacks on rebel settlements, and his approach became increasingly ruthless.
The Africanistas, as they were called, the officers who had their main experience in Africa, were ruthless. Their main job was to terrorize a colonial population, and this was an attitude that they would later bring back to the Spanish peninsula. So that very much affected Franco, and of course it was where he made what passed for his friendships.
The famous story, of course, is that with his little pot belly and his rather squeaky voice, that one of his soldiers, in fact, mocked him when he gave an order, and Franco promptly pulled out his pistol and shot him dead. I think that the war in Morocco, which was a completely ruthless war and a very savage one, underlined the fact that Franco was a very cold-hearted killer.
After being seriously wounded on the battlefield, Franco was sent back to Oviedo in Spain to recover. There, he was appointed head of the Spanish Foreign Legion. It was in Oviedo that he got to know Carmen Polo. A year later, she became his wife. Carmen was a strict Catholic and soon had major influence over her husband.
You know, he was looking for an advantageous marriage. She was from a rich family. Her family were outraged that she would hook up with a soldier, because the soldier's life in those days with these battlefield promotions was very dangerous. Her father is alleged to say, you know, you can't marry him. It's worse than marrying a bullfighter.
In a diary published a little later, the Africa veteran described his experiences. He wrote of the bold operations carried out by a Spanish battalion and of its courageous leader. But did Franco really have what it takes to be a great commander?
Franco was certainly not a strategic genius. He was very clever when it came to politics, and when it came to, in a Machiavellian sense, when it came to outmaneuvering any rivals, so nobody could challenge him. But as a military thinker or strategist, he was useless.
Franco is the Jurgen Klopp of the military. You know, he's a lucky manager. To be good in football, you've got to be lucky, you know?
In Spain, social tensions were growing. The workers' movement was gaining in power. Conflicts escalated into violence more and more often. King Alfonso and his government seemed paralyzed. The army involved itself in all major issues. Above all, power was in the hands of the elites, rich industrialists, big landowners, and the church. Catholicism was the state religion. Left-wing activists fought against the government and the church.
Whenever political unrest swelled up, priests were killed. But why? What did priests, churches and monasteries have to do with political and military issues? Because of what was seen by the overwhelming majority of the Spanish population as a very close alliance.
King Alfonso gave up and agreed to let the army take control, under the leadership of General Primo de Rivera. He was fascinated by fascism, which was sweeping over the whole of Europe from Mussolini's Italy. Primo de Rivera intended to lead the country out of crisis with the use of violence. Under the military dictatorship, young Francisco Franco's army career took off.
He was the youngest major in the Spanish army. He was the youngest colonel. And above all, he was the youngest general. When he was made brigadier general, Franco was only 33 years old.
And it's also said that one of the reasons why Franco got quick promotion was that he was forever complaining. He was writing to the ministry, demanding to know why he hadn't been promoted. He managed to establish a certain connection with the king, Alfonso XIII.
Now a general, Franco was made head of the new military academy in Saragossa. As a lecturer, he mainly sought the services of officers who, like him, had fought in Morocco.
The training that people received from Franco, well, particularly from the guys he brought in to do the teaching, was not about modern strategy or tactics or modern weaponry. It was about ideology, it was about patriotism, it was about instilling the ideals of the Africanistas.
Through his new post, Franco at last earned the public esteem he yearned for. He was now a local celebrity, and his wife, Carmen Polo, was more than happy to bathe in his success.
That made him one of the top figures in the town, that she loved all of that. You know, she loved hobnobbing with the Archbishop and the mayor and the local authorities. They were the things that mattered.
The couple had a daughter, Carmencita. Rumor quickly spread that it was not Franco who was the father, but his younger brother, Ramon, and that the child's natural mother was not Carmen Polo, but a prostitute.
We have the fact that she was never seen pregnant. We have fairly clear, again, circumstantial evidence that Franco had very little interest in sex, and this may well be to do with the very severe wound that he received in 1916, which was always referred to as a wound in the lower abdomen.
Even the military was unable to get Spain's problems under control. During the world economic crisis of 1930, Primo de Rivera resigned. King Alfonso fled into exile, and Spain became a republic. It was above all the poor who hoped for social progress. The new government announced agricultural reforms. In future, the land was to belong to the farmers. The close ties between church and state were to be severed, and the military deprived of power.
One of the first things that the Republic had to deal with was the fact that it had an army that was bigger than it could afford. Spain was a poor country, and yet it had an army which had a hugely inflated officer corps, and a disproportionate amount of the military budget went on salaries for officers. And the consequence of that was that there was not enough money left for fuel, for vehicles, for modernisation, often they couldn't do manoeuvres because there wasn't enough money for petrol. Soldiers often had to drill with wooden rifles.
The new political goal was for Spain to become a democratic society. The beneficiaries of the old order were afraid of losing their power. So too were conservative Catholics like the Francos. There was much at stake.
The division of state and church met with considerable opposition from the church. The military felt it had been given a back seat through the military reforms. All this was fermenting.
Led by General Sanjuro, the army launched an attempted coup, but it failed. Openly visible in the skies over Europe was the threatening symbol of German fascism. And in secret, numerous Nazi bases were established in the country. Spain's fascists called themselves the Falange Española, a name reflecting the ancient Greek battle order of the phalanx. Its founder was the son of Primero de Rivera, the head of state who had resigned.
It has learned from fascism what fascism has of the idea of unity, authority, and substitution of the struggles among classes by the idea of cooperation.
The young republic was a powder keg. At the next elections, conservative and ultra-right-wing parties emerged victorious. They wanted to abolish democracy again. As a sign of resistance, the communists called for a general strike. But in many places, the call had virtually no effect. Only in the north, in Asturias, did the miners steadfastly oppose the right-wing government. General Franco was called on, and he intended to make full use of the opportunity which presented itself.
I think that Franco's role in the Asturias Rising was definitely his first major public appearance in Spain, and after that, everybody knew his name.
To combat the miners' resolve, the government sent in its special unit, the Foreign Legion, Franco's battle-hardened Africanistas.
And effectively, the Minister of War says to Franco, I haven't a clue about how to deal with this sort of thing. You're in charge. Obviously, you can't be seen to be in charge, but you devised how you want this to be dealt with. Pass me the documents and I'll sign them. And so for a period of 2 to 3 weeks, Franco has what you could call on-the-job training as a dictator.
Franco was convinced that the revolt was being masterminded by the Bolsheviks. In 20 days, resistance in Asturias was brutally crushed. Franco then ordered reprisals against the local population.
There was no necessity, if you like, to take these reprisals, but the bitterness of the soldiers was so great that they basically thought we're in conquered country. And this is the interesting thing about the Army of Africa. They virtually saw Spain itself as a foreign country.
The mercenaries went about their task with such savagery that Franco was soon known as the Butcher of Asturias. Nearly 3,000 people were killed and 30,000 arrested. Many were tortured, mutilated and executed. The general had shown what it meant to oppose him.
So we can certainly say, if not before, by October 1934, Franco is thinking of himself as the saviour of Spain.
As a result of the Asturias Rising, Franco, of course, was almost enemy number one as far as the left was concerned. But of course, as far as the right was concerned, he was seen as the potential saviour even from that particular moment. That is the reason why he was appointed Chief of the General Staff, the most important position in the whole of the army.
And one of the things he does during that time is to start making preparations for a future civil war.
Spain remained politically divided. When new elections were held in 1936, surprisingly, a left-wing coalition, the Frente Popular, emerged victorious. Could democracy survive? Conservatives and the military had long been hatching plans for another coup.
In this situation, it was clear to the military that unless they took action, they stood no chance, in a democratic way, of stopping a process which was eroding their old interests.
The conspirators were led by General Emilio Mola. Together with other generals, he planned to seize power. But only a few of the conspirators would live to see the new Spain. One of the conspirators, it seems, purposely remained in the background. Francisco Franco Bahamonde. The militarily equipped police force, the Guardia Civil, stood loyally on the side of the Republic. When rumors of the approaching coup began to circulate, the government banished the generals to the provinces. Franco was transferred to the Canary Islands.
And the one thing Franco knew was that you cannot run a coup against the civil guard. And he was actually very, very lucky with the way things worked out, not to be put in jail.
In exile on Tenerife, the neutralized general made himself at home. He learnt English, played golf, and in secret, continued to pull the strings for a coup. The assassination of a right-wing politician in Madrid provided the initial spark. In the capital, violence erupted. The generals believed that their time had come. The coup began on July the 17th in Spanish Morocco. Franco led the rebels in the Canary Islands and wanted to join forces with the Africanistas as quickly as possible. Only the military commander of the Canary Islands, General Amado Balmes, could prevent Franco from doing this, but he had been killed the day before in an alleged hunting accident.
Fue asesinado por orden de Franco.
He was murdered on Franco's orders, and Franco also ordered the subsequent cover-up, a myth to prevent the truth from ever coming to light. That says a lot about Franco, because it reveals his character. He treads carefully, looks ahead, and is cunning, and he has no scruples whatsoever.
The next day, Franco flew to Morocco. His aim was to occupy southern Spain with the Africanistas. General Mola's troops advanced from the north. The elected government realized the gravity of the situation and issued a call to arms. Off Gibraltar, warships loyal to the Republic blocked the straits. For the time being at least, Franco's Africanista army was prevented from landing in Spain. Yet his troops in particular were of great importance to the coup.
Of all the various generals, with all their various jobs, Franco is the one who is in charge of the one part of the Spanish armed forces that actually works.
But Franco had a plan and good contacts with the Nazis in Germany.
Franco's first contact came before the Civil War, particularly with Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, who he'd met on numerous occasions. Canaris used to travel frequently to Spain. He was very much of a Hispanophile, and he certainly was keeping contact and realized that Franco was obviously the rising power within the Spanish army and must have sought him out.
¿Quieres decirle algo a los niños alemanes?
¿Pero qué les digo?
Lo que quieras. Anda.
Pido a Dios que todos los niños del mundo no conozcan los sufrimientos y las tristezas que tienen los niños que están aún en poder de los enemigos de mi patria. Yo deseo que todos los niños españoles tengan una casa alegre, con cariño y con juguetes, y por eso envío un beso a todos los niños del mundo.
As an ardent admirer of the composer, every summer Hitler attended the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth. Franco asked two German business friends from Morocco for help. He wanted Johannes Bernhard and Adolf Langenheim to make contact with Hitler. The two members of the National Socialist Party travelled especially to Bayreuth and handed Hitler a personal letter from Franco.
It's certainly true that it was, shall we say, a good moment for them to have gone to see Hitler at Bayreuth, because, of course, Hitler was very emotional during the period of the Wagner season at Bayreuth. And, of course, it was typical that Goering immediately wanted to call the operation Sauberfeuer, purely because of the final act.
Hitler acted immediately. He sent transport aircraft to Morocco and 6 fighter planes as an escort.
Without that air bridge, the coup would have collapsed. So Germany must bear much of the responsibility for the civil war ever erupting.
The The rebels were supposed to be led by General Sanjuro, who had been banished to Portugal. But he was killed when his plane crashed on its way to Spain. As a result, Franco took over command of all troops in the south. In the north, General Mola continued to advance. Franco was tasked with taking Madrid. But surprisingly, he changed the plan and sent most of his army to Toledo. The city was firmly in Republican hands. The siege cost Franco several weeks, but in the end, he was able to take the Alcazar, the historic fortress.
And that was vital in the world of the nationalists because the Alcazar was seen almost as a symbol of Republican survival and of bravery and sacrifice. So that was the vital moment for him to prepare his leadership bid to have total control of the nationalist movement.
His Toledo triumph made Franco popular, and he used that popularity for propaganda for his own ends.
La semilla de nuestro patriotismo regada con la sangre de tantas mártires hará fecunda la cosecha, de la cual las mejores espigas las hemos de depositar en el altar augusto de la patria.
Franco appealed, if you like, to the nationalist audience, the beatas, the very religious women, the middle class, those who were terrified of communism and socialism, because they thought that he was the most ruthless and definitely the most determined of all the generals. And that is almost certainly true.
Hitler and Mussolini had long since realized how useful another fascist state in Europe could be. But money and weapons would only be provided on one condition.
The Germans and the Italians did not want to negotiate with various commanders on the battlefield. They wanted just one contact person, and that was Franco.
The rebels made Franco their generalissimo, the commander-in-chief of the army.
Thanks to the thousands of souls who followed our movement in defense of civilization. Thanks to all those countries who passed through our some troubles and are now offering to us their sympathy and their moral support, and thanks to all those who hear this word to spread them all over the world. Country, religion, family, this is our aim and strength.
The civil war was now raging. Throughout the country, Franco's nationalist rebels were openly supported by the old upper class.
After the coup, the big landowners, the bankers, the entrepreneurs, and the church all regained their old positions.
On the side of the Republic, a left-wing alliance of socialists, communists, and anarchists stood united against big money. Socialist groups urged workers to take control of their places of work. Factories were occupied and their owners locked up or even shot. Profits from labor were no longer to end up solely in the pockets of the rich. Agricultural workers also revolted and fought for the collectivization of farmland. The unrest in Barcelona alone cost 400 lives, and often the fronts were blurred. The battles between hostile groups were never ending.
I think all of the generals expected the war would last a couple of weeks. Franco, I think, was one of the few who thought that it would last longer. Now, that's not to say he thought it would last 3 years, but he was more cautious than the others.
For some time now, the most diverse groups had also been fighting alongside Franco. Thousands took up arms. Monarchists who wanted to see King Alfonso back on the throne, Carlists who wanted a Bourbon as regent, and the Falange Española who glorified fascism.
Franco really ignored the Falange up until the outbreak of the Civil War. One must remember that even in the elections of February 1936, the Falange achieved no more than about 1,000 votes per province in Spain. Its strength, funny enough, came after the start of the Civil War, when José Antonio Primo de Rivera was already in prison. He had already been arrested by the Republican government.
Franco saw that the armed fascists could be very useful to him. In April, he declared the Falange to be the official state party and placed himself at its head. As they marched on Madrid, the rebels destroyed everything in their path, even if it was of no military importance.
He once said, "I'd have no problem killing half of Spain just to stop it becoming Marxist." He really said that.
Thousands of corpses paved Franco's way to power.
I mean, even the Germans were shocked and the Italians were shocked at times by the cruelty he showed.
There's one point where he says to the Italian ambassador, Mussolini's ambassador, "I have to conquer Spain square centimetre by square centimetre because I have to control the people who live on the land." When Hitler talks of a 1,000-year Reich, for Franco, that's short-term thinking.
Every potential opponent was arrested or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Federico García Lorca, one of Spain's most famous poets, also fell victim to the systematic cleansing. His body was simply buried by the roadside. Lorca's murder, and that of thousands of other civilians, was seen far beyond Spain's borders as a symbol of the barbarity of the Civil War. The world was shocked as it learned more and more about the carnage. It was also a war of pictures. The major news agencies sent their best reporters to Spain. Like photographer Robert Capa. His picture of the falling soldier became an icon of the 20th century. A German correspondent also reported from Spain. Herbert Frahm reported on the Civil War for several newspapers. He had fled from the Nazi dictatorship, initially to Norway, and had only recently changed his name. He now called himself Willy Brandt.
The Spanish Civil War had an extraordinary emotional appeal right across the world. So from that point of view, it seemed to symbolize the great clash of a whole generation.
Nazi Germany and Italy had already officially recognized Franco as Spain's head of government, even though his forces had still not taken Madrid. And the Republicans were being reinforced by the international brigades, volunteers from all over the world. Many had communist leanings, and few had ever held a weapon before.
Their motivation was to stop the advance of fascism in Europe. Spain was on its way to becoming a new fascist state.
The Spanish Civil War was everybody's fight, and that became apparent very, very quickly.
The ranks of the left-wing fighters included prominent intellectuals, like writers Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell, and eminent documentary filmmaker Joris Ivens from the Netherlands. In Spain, Ivens spent months filming in the theatres of war. His documentary became an international indictment of fascism. Ivens provided a different perspective from that of Frankist propaganda. He showed the sheer horror of the Civil War. His documentary from the perspective of the Spanish people is still regarded as a masterpiece. And what position did the other countries in Europe take with regards to events in Spain? In London, a non-intervention committee was set up. As members, even Germany and Italy claimed to be neutral, yet they had long been playing a role in Spain. Hitler's most important contribution to the victory of the Frankistas was now coming from the air.
General Franco ruft die gesunden Kräfte zur Abwehr des Bolschewismus, zur Rettung des Vaterlandes auf. Das nationalsozialistische Deutschland unterstützt ihn beim Kampf gegen den übermächtigen Feind und seine internationalen Helfer. Auf dem schnellsten Wege werden Kriegsmaterialien und die ersten deutschen Freiwilligen, der Grundstock der späteren Legion Condor, in Sonderflugzeugen nach Spanien überführt.
The Condor Legion was a special unit of the German Air Force, under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen. Its existence was officially denied right up to 1939. Yet the Germans had already provided crucial assistance with Franco's air bridge at the start of the coup.
It basically has the top technology available, and it makes a big difference. He has the covert help of London, which prevents the Republic arming itself. And he has a lot of help from Mussolini. There's 80,000 Italian troops. He could have won the war very quickly.
But Franco persisted with his tactic of gaining control of the country metre by metre.
Comments were made by Mussolini and Wolfram von Richthofen, who were tearing their hair out at this unnecessarily slow and exhausting approach by Franco. Franco doesn't know how to wage war. Franco is no military strategist. He's incapable of fighting a war.
Or did the Generalissimo know exactly what he was doing? Franco had already taken the south and stabilized his front outside Madrid. Now he advanced into northern Spain. In April 1937, his troops set their sights on the Basque town of Guernica. Guernica had been a holy place for the Basques and a symbol of their independence ever since the 14th century. A bridge in the center of town was seen as being of strategic importance to the Republicans. Allegedly, when Franco called for the German bombers, the bridge was to be the sole target. The Condor Legion dropped some 30 tons of bombs on the town, killing around 300 of its citizens. Luis Iriondo was 14 years old at the time of the bombing raid. He lost relatives and friends. His brother was traumatized for life. When the first bombs fell, Luis had just enough time to find safety.
The shelters weren't even finished. There was no light, no ventilation. I could scarcely breathe. We sat on the floor. The day before, I'd been given some new trousers, and my mother warned me not to get them dirty. After 15 minutes, someone said, "It's over." But as soon as we left the shelter, the bells started ringing again. The first planes have bombed the bridge, we thought, and now other aircraft are coming to bomb the town.
Incredibly, in the end, the bridge remained intact, whereas the entire town was in flames. 80% of the buildings had been destroyed.
Every Monday, a popular farmers' market was held in Guernica, and that is precisely when it all happened. That is why they chose the Monday for their bombing raid. They knew there would be more people there.
And it's quite clear, I mean, if you look at the Tagebuch of Richthofen, he makes it absolutely clear what it was all about. It was an act of terror.
Von Richthofen wrote, Guernica, a town of 5,000 inhabitants, literally razed to the ground. The start of the blaze and the collapse of several buildings was very interesting to observe. The negligible fire brigade presence brought from San Sebastian was powerless. There was a perfidious purpose behind the seemingly indiscriminate bombing. For the German Air Force to practice under real conditions for Hitler's forthcoming war. Much of what happened in the Basque Country was repeated later in Poland. For Hitler, Guernica was nothing more than training for the Second World War.
I don't think that Richthofen had any idea of the symbolic importance of Guernica to the Basques and all the rest of it. As far as he was concerned, I think that it was just basically an exercise in aerial terror.
German aircraft also bombed churches to test the impact on solid stone buildings. But the German pilots had little sympathy for Franco and his movement.
There was an atheistic aspect to National Socialism, and many Germans were not happy that the government was fighting for clerics and big landowners. Over a beer or a glass of wine in the evening, it's alleged people would comment, "Actually, we're fighting for the wrong side."
In reaction to the bombing, Picasso painted Guernica. Shown at the 1937 World Fair in Paris, the work became world famous as a symbol of the suffering of the Spanish people.
Guernica is the first total destruction of an unprotected town in the history of warfare.
Franco had outlived all his rivals. The founder of the fascist movement, Primo de Rivera, was executed by the Republicans. Many of the former co-conspirators had fallen into enemy hands and been killed. Only General Mola could still have contested his claim to power in Spain. But he died in an air crash in 1937. The cause of the accident has never been established. The province of Aragon in the north was one of the few regions still held by the Republicans. Resistance was strongest in Belchite. Franco deployed all his military forces there. They attacked the town for 2 weeks. Finally, Belchite was destroyed and Aragon fell. Franco now held virtually the whole of Spain. his triumph seemed almost certain. But it was not until July 1938 that the decisive battle took place. On the Ebro, a river in southwest Catalonia. Franco himself took part in the battle, one of the longest and most brutal of the entire war. In the end, it is said, the river ran red with blood.
The decisive factor in the war was undoubtedly the total air superiority of the Franquistas, thanks to the intervention of the Condor Legion. So it is no exaggeration to say that without German and Italian, but primarily German intervention, Franco would probably not have triumphed in the Civil War.
What was still missing were the cities. For months, Franco laid siege to Madrid and Barcelona. Cut off from the outside world, their citizens starved. And for weeks on end, the two cities were bombed nearly every day.
The next day, Franco arrived. His troops marched into Barcelona. I can still remember it quite clearly. We could see them coming from a distance. We could still have opened fire, but it would have been pointless. The Republicans had already left.
En el día de hoy, cautivo y desarmado el Ejército Rojo, han alcanzado las tropas nacionales sus últimos objetivos militares. La guerra ha terminado.
The cost? 500,000 dead, through warfare and terror. But how could so much suffering and death be compatible with the Christian faith of Franco and his strictly Catholic wife?
We have anecdotes to the effect that when people who knew her interceded with her, asking her to talk to Franco to stop someone being executed or so on, that she would say, you know, Paco's far too busy to be interrupted with something like this, that she did nothing, as far as we know, to soften or to limit his ruthlessness.
After 3 years of civil war, the small boy from El Ferrol was ruler of Spain. Franco had achieved his goal, but his reign of terror was only just beginning. April 1939. 3 years of bloody civil war have claimed 500,000 lives and turned Spain into a different country. Without Hitler's help, Franco would never have come to power. The German bombers of the Condor Legion had enabled the Nationalists to emerge victorious. Entire regions lay in ruins. But instead of showing gratitude, Franco infuriated Hitler. At home, the warlord was henpecked. His wife saw to it that her brother-in-law was given positions at the highest level. The unpopular relative pursued his own goals and could have posed a serious threat to the dictator. The emergence of the new regime was marked by subterfuge. Following the success of the coup, Franco was to head the transitional government. His brother, Nicholas, secretly altered the document appointing him.
What Nicholas Franco did, of course, was that he changed the proclamation at the last moment. And this caused fury with the other generals, because he was supposed to be just the head of the government of the Spanish state for the length of the war.
As this proclamation was going to press, the wording was changed from head of government to head of state. Thus, Franco was automatically appointed head of state.
ernannt worden.
Franco was now virtually all-powerful. He had already proclaimed a new beginning months before. In the pose of a statesman, he extended his hand to the whole world.
En la entrada de 1939, la España nacional ofrece a todos los pueblos, con sus glorias y heroicos sacrificios, su voluntad de cooperar a la paz del mundo con su victoria. En la España que forjamos no habrá un hogar sin lumbre ni una familia sin pan.
Franco was not averse to using fine words in his private life either. He would often test the patience of his listeners for hours on end.
Franco in private, when he was with, I say, friends, if one can call them that, was an absolute blabbermouth. You couldn't shut him up. You know, and of course, once he was in power, no one dared to shut him up.
After the Civil War, Spain split into winners and losers, friends and enemies. Whole regions had been devastated. The economy had collapsed. Most people had no idea how they were going to feed their family.
Había hambruna. No hambre. Hambruna.
There was famine.
Hambruna medieval.
Just like in the Middle Ages and the 30 Years' War.
Como en la guerra de los 30
People
años.
weren't just hungry, they were starving.
Hambre,
We're talking about total famine.
pero total.
People collapsed and died in the streets.
Muerta por las calles.
That might sound exaggerated, but it is precisely what happened.
Era así.
Franco gave himself the title of Caudillo de España, the political and military leader of Spain. He and his family moved into the El Pardo Palace in Madrid, the former summer residence of the king. Megalomania for all to see.
You don't get to be a dictator if you're normal. You know, you think Hitler was normal, you think Donald Trump's normal. I mean, you know, why aren't you a dictator? You're too normal.
Another expression of power was Franco's exotic bodyguard, the Guardia Mora. This Moroccan elite force underlined the claim to sovereignty over Spain's colonies in Africa. 2 days after his victory, the church also recognized Franco as Spain's leader. He had his dagger blessed to symbolize that he saw himself as defender of the faith. Church leaders had constantly given him their support even during the war, as he went about cleansing the country with violence.
Well, the Spanish Catholic Church had supported, shall we say, the killing of anybody who was basically not Catholic in the earlier periods. We've had the Inquisition during those particular... Only in Spain was the Spanish Inquisition, you know, reintroduced again in the early part of the 19th century. The Spanish Catholic Church was the most reactionary in certainly the whole of Europe.
Franco regarded democracy as dangerous. He had appointed an authoritarian government for conquered regions even during the war. In the summer of 1939, he appointed a second one.
Es un gobierno
This government represented the most important families of the rebels.
Familias políticas de los sublevados.
On the one hand, there was a military hegemony. Then there were also the right-wing Catholics, the Carlists, the Phalangists, and a few technocrats.
Están los falangistas y están algunos tecnócratas, esencialmente.
They were all subservient to Franco. His models were the fascist regimes in Italy and Germany, and their leaders, Mussolini and Hitler. In Spain, the so-called Roman salute of the fascists was introduced.
The concept of the Führer, the leader, was adopted from German National Socialism.
Es decir, Franco como fuente
Franco was the
del
sole
derecho.
source of law.
Su voluntad
Like Hitler, his will was law.
Como Hitler.
And like Hitler too, he was not subject to any restrictions.
A restricción alguna.
A family member who became a key figure in the new Spain, Ramón Serrano Suñer, the brother-in-law of Franco's wife. She revered the smart lawyer who had just married her sister. Franco was far from happy about Carmen's wish for Ramón to be given political office.
One of the reasons why Franco turned against his brother-in-law was that when Franco was talking rubbish in the family home and Ramón wanted to say anything, Carmen would say, "Paco, just shut up and listen to Ramón, who knows what he's talking about."
The new brother-in-law, Serrano Suñer, was a far-right functionary in the Falange, the Spanish fascist movement. Franco made the Falange, whose members always appeared in blue shirts, the state party.
Serrano Suñer was also much more pro-Nazi than Franco. He'd established close relations with Himmler. He thought that basically in Spain they should imitate many more things of the Nazi party. And that, in that sense, he was very much closer to the Falange.
Much to Franco's displeasure, ideologically, Spain's fascists were moving ever closer to the German Nazi party. Despite this, brother-in-law Serrano Suñer soon became his main man.
He assumes the job of trying to create a state, which means trying to create ministries and so on. And this he does very, very well, and he creates for Franco a state.
The restless Serrano Suñer soon controlled the press and the propaganda machine. He liked to go his own way, which later proved to be his undoing. Five months after the Spanish Civil War came to an end, Hitler invaded Poland. It was the start of the Second World War, the beginning of a chain of crimes against humanity. Basically, it was clear on which side Spain stood ideologically, but Franco was reluctant to commit himself.
He did not want to depend too much on the fascist states and on Germany. But at the same time, he had to pay back for the Condor Legion. And this is one of the reasons why, again, fish then became such an important part of the Spanish diet for protein, because basically the pigs, the sheep, and the cattle were all being shipped off to Germany as part payment for the Condor Legion.
Without the aircraft of the German Condor Legion, Franco's triumph in the Civil War would not have been possible. Hundreds of Spanish towns and villages were bombed. In return for that assistance, Franco was now supplying Germany with raw materials and food, but the Caudillo was not prepared to go any further, at least not officially.
He was cautious because he had to deal with Britain and America, which held control over fuel and food, so that was crucial. But he was desperate to secure help from Germany. He was desperate to help Germany.
Franco was in a fix. He had to pledge strict neutrality. But behind the scenes, he continued to cooperate with Hitler.
Despite its neutral front, Spain was actually the fourth member of the Axis. Germany's secret services operated unhindered in Spain, whereas MI5, MI6 and the Secret Service were kept under close police scrutiny. Spain was no neutral country.
In May and June 1940, German forces conquered the Netherlands, Belgium and France. Franco was faced with a difficult decision. Should he follow Italy's example and enter the war on Hitler's side? Shortly before German troops entered Paris, Franco announced that his country had adopted a new position.
Spain abandoned its neutrality and defined itself as non-belligerent. It was now not actually in the war. However, it had aligned itself with one of the belligerents.
Franco was a brilliant opportunist who was able to cloak himself in the right ideologies to give him the strength that he needed. But as far as he was concerned, power alone was the main question.
Following Germany's victory over France, many Spanish citizens also had to fear for their lives. During the Spanish Civil War, nearly 500,000 had fled to France. Left-wing politicians and intellectuals. They were now in the sights of the Gestapo. In Paris, around 15,000 Spanish exiles were arrested. They were regarded as dangerous communists.
At the beginning of August, the first Spanish nationals were sent to a concentration camp. At the time, there was only one concentration camp outside Germany's old borders. That was Mauthausen in Austria.
Together with his father, José Marfil was also arrested by the SS and deported to Mauthausen. He had fought for the Republic, and in France, he had joined the resistance.
A high-ranking officer arrived and made a speech. "You came in through this door," he said, "but that is how you will leave." And he pointed to one of the chimneys at the crematorium, which had smoke coming from it.
Before the first Spanish nationals were sent to Mauthausen, the German embassy in Madrid had contacted the Spanish government and asked what should be done with their fellow countrymen. Franco's ministries showed no reaction.
Franco was totally indifferent to the fate of Spanish exiles who were sent to Mauthausen or other concentration camps. They were Reds. In his eyes, they were not Spanish, just dirt, scabies. They were of no interest to him. I lost my left eye in a beating. Suddenly everything was white. Things stayed that way for a while. Then the brightness started to fade. But I couldn't see out of my left eye. I pretended to be fine. Had they noticed that something was wrong with me, I'd have gone straight to the crematorium. Other inmates died because the blows to their backs broke their spines.
José Marfil's father was the first Spaniard to die in a concentration camp. By the end of the war, the Nazis had murdered 6,500 Spanish prisoners in Mauthausen alone. Officially, Franco was unwilling to intervene in the war. But after France was defeated, his troops occupied the strategically important region around Tangier.
Franco, once again, was an opportunist in the early period, in particularly from 1940 and the collapse of France. He saw the possibility of taking over some of the French provinces or the French territories in North Africa, because he loved the idea of re-establishing the Spanish Empire.
Hitler's next plan was to defeat Britain. If he could succeed in taking Gibraltar, he would virtually control the Mediterranean. A reconnaissance team had already drawn up a plan. Operation Felix. Located at the southern tip of Spain, Gibraltar had been occupied by the British for 300 years. Its fortified naval base was well defended. Hitler planned to attack Gibraltar from the Spanish mainland. All he needed was Franco's permission.
Franco was certainly not keen on the idea of any German troops moving into the Iberian Peninsula in 1940-41, purely because he, out of national pride, the idea of them crossing Spanish territory to take Gibraltar, but also because if Gibraltar was to be taken, he wanted it for himself.
Germany intended to break British resistance with a force of 16,000 troops. But Franco refused to approve the plan. He feared the British. If Spain openly participated in the war, his islands in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean would be threatened.
But he also knew perfectly well that the Allies would retaliate if that was the case, and he knew that they would go for the Canary Islands, and so he would lose the Canary Islands.
Hitler and Franco needed each other, but they never became friends. Their only meeting in the French border town of Hendaye was an embarrassing failure. Franco was late in arriving. Hitler had to wait on the platform. When the Spanish leader finally arrived, he cut a surprisingly self-confident figure. He demanded economic aid, arms, and French territories in Africa. But he could not be induced to participate in the war.
Hitler was exasperated with Franco as a result of the meeting at Hendaye. He realized, in fact, that Franco was not going to do anything for him, basically. He was going to do at the absolute minimum and yet try to get as much as he possibly could out of it.
The two dictators conferred for 9 hours. The stubborn Spaniard infuriated Hitler.
Well, of course, Paul Schmidt, the Hitler's interpreter, wrote later that Hitler went off very angry, saying he'd rather have 3 teeth pulled out without anaesthetic than have to spend another hour talking to Franco.
The meeting did at least provide Franco with a photograph that would make an impression back home. But the picture was a crude fake. On the original snapshot, Franco had his eyes closed. Now, he had a sovereign look about him. The head from a different photograph had simply been stuck on.
When this picture is compared with other photographs from the original venue, the Franco on the fake is not the Franco who was in Hendaye.
According to a secret protocol, Franco only offered a vague prospect of Spain entering the war, and Hitler did not make any firm promises either.
When the conference was over, Hitler said, "You can't do anything with this man." While Franco reckoned that the Germans are mentally disturbed and have no manners.
Nevertheless, Franco promised to supply the Germans with tungsten, a metal vital to the armaments industry. He also sent the División Azul, the Blue Division, an army of volunteers, to provide support for Hitler's Russian campaign. The idea came from brother-in-law Serrano Suñer.
It was, in a way you could say, it was the least he could do. It was a gesture of support. It got rid of some troublesome elements, you know, some of the more enthusiastic phalangists who wanted to make what they called la revolución pendiente, the pending revolution.
Spain's fascists in the Falange were convinced communist haters. They called for much closer cooperation with Hitler's Germany. Francisco Armengu signed up voluntarily. He had been too young to fight in the Civil War. But now, he desperately wanted to join the Blue Division.
When Serrano Suñer said, "It is Russia's fault," I thought, this is my chance. Like many others, I signed up. We also volunteered because we wanted to give the Germans something back, because of their support for Franco in the Civil War.
In 1941, the first 18,000 troops arrived in Germany for basic training.
El primer contacto con una zona de guerra divierte a nuestros camaradas y no divierte menos a los camaradas alemanes que entienden el universal lenguaje de la juventud a través de las alegrías y de las bromas de los españoles, soldados tradicionalmente alegres.
Originally, Franco wanted to send no more than 4,000 troops, but 4 times as many young men signed up. On the military training ground at Grafenwöhr, they practiced for the front in German uniforms. It was a 5-week crash course. Most of the young Spanish soldiers had no military experience whatsoever.
They gave us hand grenades. I got one too. They pulled the pin and I threw the grenade, but it didn't go very far. The sergeant major leapt forward, picked up the grenade and threw it a long way. I didn't have the strength and I hadn't been trained. It was my first hand grenade and it was live.
2 months later, the Spanish troops left for Russia. The Blue Division took part in the attack on Leningrad. At first, the German soldiers made fun of their Spanish comrades, but they were ready for anything.
The German army command to begin with, of course, was very cynical and skeptical because they had not been very impressed from what they'd seen during the Spanish Civil War. But I think they saw them fight very bravely and impressively on the Leningrad front, and so their attitude changed.
In the bitter Russian winter, Franco's troops suffered heavy losses. The Soviet army put up fierce resistance. More than 4,000 Spanish soldiers died in battle or froze to death.
It must have been just before Christmas. The Russians launched 3 major attacks. I was carrying the machine gun. Some distance in front of us, we could see 3 huge snow-covered trees. The Russians had concealed themselves there and were now advancing. They were Mongols or Siberians, high on vodka and clad entirely in white. We drove them back with the machine gun, but after a while, they advanced again. That happened 3 times, and then there was quiet.
In London, Churchill's government was alarmed at Spain's growing support for Hitler. The British feared that Franco would soon openly enter the war on Germany's side. That had to be prevented at all costs, if necessary, even with unorthodox means.
They organized a bribery operation. Franco's brother and a few generals were offered money to dissuade him from entering the war on the side of the Axis powers.
Franco was playing a dangerous game. With his blessing, the German Navy was operating important bases in the Canary Islands. German submarines were refueling in ports in the Spanish group of islands. And in Spain, Hitler's Secret Service was running its biggest agency outside Germany. But since the Civil War, the United States had been supplying Spain with aid. And that was something Franco was unwilling to risk losing.
America, even though they could not in any way support Britain in the fight against Hitler, were able to help keep Franco out of the war by threatening to cut off wheat imports and oil. And that's one of the reasons why Franco could not align himself completely with Hitler.
First and foremost, it was Franco's brother-in-law, Serrano Suñer, who was cultivating relations with Germany. In the eyes of the Spanish military, he was getting too powerful.
In early 1941, he effectively controlled the Ministry of the Interior, the Foreign Ministry, and the Falange. And at that point, the generals started to conspire against him, and they would complain to Franco.
Unlike Franco, Suñer wanted to enter the war at once.
Serrano Suñer, por lo que todos sabemos,
Serrano Suñer was now representing German interests more and more vehemently. In fact, in the end, in May 1941, the Spanish generals who were against the war and were being bribed by the British went to the British and asked them, what if Serrano Suñer were to meet with an accident?
By now, Franco also found that his eager brother-in-law was becoming too powerful. Serrano Suñer's enthusiasm for the war was jeopardizing his policy of cautious maneuvering and non-commitment. And that is something no dictator can tolerate.
Franco was never entirely at ease with Serrano Suñer and eventually got rid of him at a key moment during the time when the invasion of Russia was taking place in 1941.
A short time later, in the Franco household, the ousted brother-in-law was to make even more enemies. In 1942, a feature film entitled Raza played in Spanish cinemas. It told the story of a family from the 19th century through to the Civil War. The themes were treachery and heroic death, but above all, patriotism. What few people knew was that it was based on a screenplay written along with the production directions by Franco himself under a pseudonym. And indeed, the main character did resemble the dictator.
It's all about himself. It's totally autobiographical. And the hero is clearly himself.
Gracias, Pedro. Pero tú sabes que yo no puedo hacer eso. Ocúpate de estos pequeños.
It's said that he used to watch the film at least once a week and would cry buckets.
In Spain, the foundations of a new state, Franco style, were becoming clear. No constitution, just laws. He had already announced the first one, the Labour Charter, as it was known, while the Civil War was still raging.
España cumple en los momentos actuales su designio providencial. Como en otras épocas, derrama ahora su sangre en defensa de la civilización. El trabajo, estimado como el más ineludible de los deberes, será el único exponente de la voluntad popular.
The law promised workers a minimum wage, insurance, and even paid holidays. But first and foremost, it reinforced the rights of entrepreneurs. Wages were dictated by the state, and striking was seen as a serious offense.
The victors tasted the fruits of their triumph wherever possible. So exploitation continued as before. The big landowners were more brutal and more radical than ever.
In a second fundamental law, Franco proclaimed the creation of the new parliament. Officially, it was to be the supreme representation of the people. In reality, though, it was to be nothing more than a political backdrop. an assembly by the grace of Franco, which at best was allowed to make suggestions to the dictator.
It had no legislative character or function. It merely advised the head of state.
Economic policy was an important pillar in Franco's new state. The aim was for Spain to become independent of the world market, a kind of national self-provider, solely on the basis of Spanish raw materials. Franco even wanted Spain to produce its own armaments and aircraft.
Franco believed that the Spanish nation had to purge itself. And the only way was by cutting out all foreign influences, and that's why autarky appealed to him, and I think in that particular way. But the suffering was appalling. I mean, the starvation in Spain. Everybody almost was on the brink of semi-starvation, apart from those who were, shall we say, important in the government or business people and so forth.
The crisis reached catastrophic proportions. For many, the propaganda slogan, "No Spaniard without bread," was sheer cynicism. 3 years after the end of the Civil War, for most of the population, hunger was a part of everyday life.
There was simply nothing to eat. And that at a time when my mother was on her own and had 5 children to feed. My school was just around the corner from our house. At break time, they handed out bread and butter and sugar. I always saved what I got for my mother. One day, a teacher noticed this and asked me when I planned to eat it. I explained that I wanted to take it home for my mother. "Come with me," he said, "and I'll give you some more bread. Eat what you have been given and put the other bread away. That's for your mother."
Franco's economic policy was a total failure. Had it not been for grain imports from America, Spain would have been finished. Many people exchanged their last possessions for food just to survive. Traders became rich. Another law was designed to safeguard Franco's grip on power. Ordinary citizens were banned from engaging in any form of political activity. Trade unionists and members of the old parties were suspected of being insurgents. They had to fear for their lives.
Franco no longer engaged in politics. He was pursuing a divine plan. Preliminary proceedings were held in which verdicts were passed before people had barely taken their seats. You either got no lawyer at all, or a member of the Frankist military, who was totally biased anyway.
Retroactively, Franco had everyone punished who, as he put it, had disturbed the social peace. By that, he meant all supporters of the former republic, politicians, writers and teachers. Any opposition was to be nipped in the bud, for the good of the nation.
When Franco says Spain, and this goes on right till the day he dies, he doesn't mean Spain in the way you mean it or I mean it. He doesn't mean all of the country. He means those who think like we do.
It was the start of a reign of terror. More than 170 concentration camps were built to re-educate alleged enemies of the state. Franco's campaign against real and presumed opponents continued, with mass arrests and executions.
In the years after the Civil War, Franco himself always spoke of victory. He never talked of peace. 1939 was declared the Año de la Victoria, the year of victory. To a certain extent, it was supposed to mark the start of a new era.
Spain needed workers for reconstruction. Political prisoners had to do forced labor on building sites or in factories loyal to the regime. In this way, some were able to shorten their sentences and avoid execution. Tens of thousands were sent to work in the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. Northwest of Madrid, in the mountains of the Sierra de Guadarrama, they cut a huge basilica out of the rock. A monument to the 30,000 nationalist dead, and a mausoleum for the deceased founder of the fascist Falange movement, and possibly for Franco himself. Towering over it is a stone cross, 150 meters high.
I think it was the same as the pharaohs in Egypt had when they built the pyramids. It was a great personal, the monument that, as Franco himself said, would challenge history throughout the ages. Part of his ego.
The gangs of convicts worked on the mausoleum for nearly 20 years, and Franco's propaganda tirelessly vaunted the construction as an act of reconciliation. But his politics told a different tale. In particular, regions with their own marked identity were subject to massive oppression. Franco even banned the Basque and Catalan languages.
I once asked a friend something who was sitting next to me at the table. I didn't notice that a teacher was standing behind us. He immediately threw me out of the classroom and made me stay there. Here we speak Spanish, he said.
Yet, despite all the terror, there were rumblings in Franco's realm. Serrano Suñer and his fascist hardliners were lining up against the dictator. At the same time, monarchists were calling for the restoration of the royal house, as Franco had promised after the Civil War. The dictator removed his fiercest critics from office. He ousted his brother-in-law, Serrano Suñer, from the last of the political posts he still held. This move, it seems, was also prompted by Franco's wife Carmen, because Suñer was cheating on her sister.
It then turned out that Serrano Suñer, who was something of a ladies' man, was having an affair with the wife of a Spanish aristocrat. And Mrs. Franco was furious about this. There were complaints, and Doña Carmen had now become his bitterest enemy. And that led in early 1942 to him getting the sack, basically.
On the foreign policy front, Franco's delaying tactics paid off, because in the Second World War, things were changing. The Allies had landed in North Africa, virtually off the Spanish coast. And after Stalingrad, Hitler's Russian campaign was on the brink of failure. Franco's Blue Division, his División Azul, was still fighting for Germany. But the Caudillo needed to send a signal.
First, the American ambassador, Carlton Hayes, went to see Franco. So too did British Ambassador Samuel Hoare, who told him, "Excellency, in view of the current situation, one should perhaps consider the possibility of repatriating the División Azul." And indeed, on October the 12th, after exactly 2 years, the División Azul left the front.
Franco had sent nearly 48,000 troops to the Eastern Front. More than 4,000 had died, and hundreds would spend years as Soviet prisoners of war.
Franco broke up the Blue Division partly because he had quite a good instinct and a nose for seeing that the war was changing, that the Germans were losing their advantage, losing the momentum of their attack. And basically, with America in the war from December 1941, geopolitically, there was no way that the Axis, that the Germans and the Italians, could ever win the war.
When the first troops returned from the war, Madrid had celebrated its heroes. Now, no one cheered.
When they came back in 1943, there were practically no official receptions. Those who had gone to Grafenwöhr in Bavaria to fight as heroes returned 2 years later in total silence. The country no longer wanted anything to do with the Blue Division.
Franco,
since he was regarded as politically neutral, Franco had to cancel the big welcome home celebrations. All the others returned almost unnoticed. I was lucky to be one of the first homecomers. After the celebration, we stayed for a while. Then we took off our uniforms and handed them back. We collected our passports and went home.
The Western powers kept a close watch on Spain to see how clearly it would disassociate itself from Nazi Germany, because Franco too had railed against the alleged world Jewish conspiracy.
And the idea was that the Jews were the capitalists in New York, but they also controlled the left because they were also the communists in Moscow. I mean, lunacy, but Franco believed it.
From 1942, Hitler's genocide of the Jews meant that Franco's regime was faced with some difficult questions. Because, like here in the Balkans, Sephardi Jews lived all over Europe, the descendants of Jews who had been expelled from Spain in the 15th century. Later, they were allowed to have Spanish citizenship again, so they were actually under Franco's protection.
Franco must have realized that the policy of total annihilation had started in December 1942, when the Allied nations of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States condemned the Nazi regime for the Holocaust and threatened their reprisals at the end of the war. So Franco was clear from that particular point.
Spanish Jews all over Europe tried to escape the Holocaust and flee to their old homeland. Franco could have saved many of them, but he hesitated.
The truth of the matter was that there were individual diplomatic representatives in different countries, particularly in Hungary and Romania, who went to enormous trouble and went through danger to help Jews, and that's absolutely true. But that's nothing to do with Franco or the regime. Franco himself, who until very late was using a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric, did nothing.
Over 50,000 Spanish Jews from France and Greece alone were deported by the Germans and murdered. Yet, until well after the war, Franco had himself feted as a savior of the Jews. And indeed, he did allow thousands of Jews transit through Spain, but only those who were going to leave straight away, for Britain or the United States, were granted an entry visa.
For as far as Franco was concerned, it was quite a good gesture to try and show a little bit of humanity without any risk to himself.
Jews from all over Europe hoped to escape through Spain. At the border, they had to surrender most of their possessions. But in this way, almost 50,000 managed to flee from the Nazis.
Even internal investigations carried out later in Spain admit that we could have saved many more Jews if we'd wanted to, or not been so hesitant.
June the 6th, 1944. In Normandy, in northern France, the Americans, the British, and their allies began their liberation of Europe. There was now hardly any doubt that Nazi Germany would lose the war. Franco's hesitation in not openly entering the war on Hitler's side was now paying off.
Franco's behavior in World War II was completely self-interested, self-centered, only looking at it from a purely Spanish point of view. And from that point of view, he managed to keep Spain out of the war. Spain would not have survived if it had to fight at that particular stage because of basically economic and even food resources, to say nothing of the military aspect.
In April 1945, Soviet troops took Berlin. Hitler committed suicide and his reign of terror came to an end. The defenders in the final battle for Berlin also included Spanish fascists. Although Franco had long since disbanded the Blue Division, it was their personal decision to fight on for their illusion.
Lots of them stayed till the very end. I mean, there were Spaniards were defending the chancellery in Berlin at the very end.
Franco had managed to contain the warmongers in his own ranks. Consequently, his regime had survived the Second World War virtually intact. Franco, the shrewd player who aimed to please everyone, while constantly concealing his true colours.
Franco wanting to be almost like a sphinx, so nobody could actually identify what his real political opinions were. This was certainly the case before the coup, before the rising in Spain in 1936, and it was very much the case later on. Nobody could really pin down exactly what he thought on certain cases. And from that point of view, it was a tremendous advantage to him.
No one at the time suspected that Spain still had 30 years of Franco's dictatorship ahead of it. The unfathomable despot profited first and foremost from external circumstances and from a boundless feeling for power.
In 1945, Franco is saying, don't worry, Hitler is tempting in the Russians, tempting in the Americans, and when he's got them in, he will unleash the Wunderwaffen and he will destroy them. And you think, this guy, I mean, he says the most mind-bogglingly stupid things you could imagine. And yet, at the same time, he's quite cunning. And that is a real conundrum. It's a real problem for a biographer.
Franco took every possible step, internally to eliminate his enemies, and externally to suddenly appear as a reliable partner of the West. Many Spaniards would benefit from this tactic, but far more would suffer under the shackles of the dictatorship. The Second World War was now over, and in global politics, changes were taking place. The victorious powers were taking a good look at Spain because its head of state had, unofficially, been a close ally of Adolf Hitler. Many Spaniards were hoping that Franco would be overthrown and the tyranny brought to an end. Could Franco survive and be acknowledged outside Spain? (1945). At the end of the Second World War, Franco's friendship with the defeated Axis powers put him in a tight spot.
Whereas, obviously Mussolini's murdered, Hitler commits suicide, Franco is not going to do that. The new mask that he put on was the mask that he felt was necessary for survival.
The dictator had to disassociate himself from his old friends. He saw himself not as a fascist, but as a military ruler. His regime, however, had distinctly fascist characteristics. Would the Western powers accept that? As early as July 1945, Franco had the Roman salute banned. Deceptively similar to the Nazi salute, it had been introduced by Franco himself. And he reshuffled his government. The fascist state party, the Falange, which had helped him gain power, was now a threat to his future. Franco threw the fascists out of his cabinet and instead strengthened the Catholic forces in Spain. The appointment of a new foreign minister with close ties to the church was intended to appease the Western powers.
Franco tenía una concepción que se dijo a los aliados.
In reality, in Franco's eyes, the outcome of the Second World War was not so pivotal. He told the Allies quite clearly that what was really important now was the fight against the common enemy, communism, the destroyer of Christian and Western civilization.
But Franco was misguided. What really mattered to the new ruling powers were freedom and democracy. The Potsdam Conference explicitly excluded Spain from all the international community's plans. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin openly called for Franco to be overthrown. But the Western powers did not want another trouble spot in Europe. Even though they disapproved of his regime, Franco did not constitute an acute threat. So he was left to his own devices.
It was assumed that the regime wouldn't last long, that sooner or later, and probably sooner, Franco's Spain would simply disappear.
A close watch was kept on the dictator. The close relations with Nazi Germany had left traces. By the end of the war, there were around 5,000 Germans living in Spain, many of whom had only arrived during the National Socialist era. The United States in particular feared that Spain could become a safe haven for Nazi war criminals. The Nazi Party's foreign wing had offices and contacts all over the country. In the final months before Hitler's fall, more and more German Nazis had fled to Spain, and Franco had received them with open arms. Lufthansa operated daily flights to Spain until just a few weeks before the end of the war. The Germans controlled key industries in Spain and had established a close network. To curb German influence, the victorious powers wanted to seize German assets in Spain as reparation. In order to see this plan implemented swiftly, they promised Franco's regime 30% of the revenue. With German companies in Spain worth an estimated 400 million euros in today's money, it was a lucrative deal.
The Spanish position was characterized by pronounced pragmatism. They ensured that they helped themselves to the bankruptcy assets of the Third Reich, always claiming that they had been pressurized to do that by the Allies, and pointing out that their own Spanish hands had been tied.
This interference by the Allies annoyed Franco. However, the unexpected influx of money was more than welcome. And he sensed the opportunity to destroy German supremacy in the Spanish economy in an elegant way, and without even having to jeopardize his good relations with Germany, because he could hide behind the decision taken by the Allies. The Caudillo felt a great affinity for the Germans. He had always marveled at their military achievements. Cultivating contacts with the German community in exile was something the dictator attended to personally. Contact, for example, with SS General Johannes Bernhard, who in 1936 had persuaded Hitler to support Franco in the Civil War. In gratitude, Franco allowed Bernhard to build up a lucrative trade empire with the parastatal holding Sofindus. From Spain, the former Mannesmann manager had taken care of virtually the entire exchange of goods with Nazi Germany. Now, after the war, he too had to fear for his future.
Johannes Bernhard was cunning enough to initially cooperate with the Allies, and for some time this enabled him to avoid being deported, or at least appearing on the lists with which the Allies tried to get Germans sent back to Germany for denazification.
In November 1945, the Allies demanded that Spain deport more than 250 German Nazis. Those being sought became nervous. Many wrote to Franco asking for his protection. And the dictator was happy to help old friends. Not even half of those wanted by the Allies were deported. Another Allied wanted list drawn up in 1947 also contained the name of Johannes Bernhard, but the former SS officer was able to rely on Franco.
Cuando los aliados le piden
When the Allies demanded his deportation, Franco refused. Instead, he made Bernhard a Spanish citizen and gave him a house in Denia. There, Bernhard led a comfortable life, far removed from events during the war. Finally, in 1950, he emigrated to Argentina.
As financial security in his luggage, Bernhard had a valuable painting by El Greco, a gift from his patron General Franco. In 1948, Allied pressure to have Nazi war criminals deported lessened, and several hundred were able to abscond to South America. The majority headed for Argentina, where its dictator, Juan Perón, granted them political asylum. Attempts by the Caudillo to give his regime a veneer of democracy were all too flimsy, because he even openly insisted that the Spanish people needed authoritarian leadership because of their mentality. Franco's closeness to former Nazis and Italian fascists was viewed on the international scene as a serious stigma. So, for the time being, efforts by the Spanish regime to become an equal partner for the Western powers had failed. This international isolation had dramatic consequences for the dictator and, even more, for the Spanish people. Without the protection of his defeated fascist partners Hitler and Mussolini, Franco needed a new strategy for survival. In December 1946, in front of the Royal Palace in Madrid, he took a new tack.
He created the idea, which was utterly fraudulent, but given his control over the media, it worked, that Spain was the victim of a blockade by the Western powers. So people rallied to him. He actually said that the Americans and the British want to bring down Spain because they are jealous of the phalangist regime. And people believe that.
Franco presented his supporters with the tried and tested spectres. The decadent Western democracies and the Soviet communists were in league against Spain, and only he, the Caudillo, could protect his people from the threat.
During his time in Morocco, Franco had become convinced that he had been chosen by Providence to play a special role for Spain. And this also gave him a certain strength to survive this period. Above all, he was sure that he could give the country something it hadn't had for a long time: security and stability.
The international community was unimpressed by the new, old sounds coming from Spain. In fact, the newly founded United Nations passed a resolution against Spain. Nearly all ambassadors were recalled from Madrid. Franco was to be put under pressure to pave the way for democracy. New resistance to the dictatorship was also germinating in Spain itself. In many places, supporters of the old republic had gone underground and formed guerrilla units. And they were now receiving support because since the end of the war, Republican fighters had been returning home from France. With the experience they had gained with the French resistance, they wanted to contribute to the struggle against Franco. The anti-Franco movement was supported first and foremost by the Communist Party in exile. It organized militant groups and carried out acts of sabotage designed to demoralize the hated regime. In León, resistance had flourished ever since the Civil War, and it was there in 1942 that the first official guerrilla unit in Spain was formed. Francisco Martínez joined it in 1944 as a 21-year-old. The first fighters from nearby France soon arrived as support.
They returned in 1945. In those days, we still believed that Franco would not receive international recognition. They spent 2 or 3 enthusiastic years with us. They were all here voluntarily, but we weren't. That's why we also differed in our strategies. Basically, they kept to themselves. But our principle was to foster close ties with the people, with the villages, with the children, with the women, with everyone. Without the women and children, guerrilla activities would have been impossible. It is only thanks to them that we were able to survive in enemy territory.
Martínez had supported the guerrillas for years as a messenger boy. Like many people in the region, his mother also sympathized with the left-wing republic. Regions with difficult terrain and a weak infrastructure offered the resistance fighters good hiding places. Guerrilla units were especially active in Spain's mountainous regions, but they also fought in some major cities like Barcelona, where independence for Catalonia was also a goal. Franco wanted to keep the political resistance under wraps, so guerrilla attacks were rarely reported by the state media. On no account was the resistance to strike a chord with the people. If newspapers carried any reports at all, it was to depict the guerrilla activities as the work of common criminals. Yet since 1947, the regime had been reacting with marked severity. The punitive activities of the secret police were designed to hit not only the fighters themselves, but also their families and those who supported them.
They sent members of the secret police to mingle with the people and look for anyone who was prepared to betray us. At the same time, people no longer showed any enthusiasm for resistance. It all came together. The result was total failure without any prospects for the future. If we'd stayed for just 1 more year, they would have murdered us all.
Francisco Martínez managed to flee to France. Demoralized by Franco's repression, like him, many fighters left the country. It was not until many years later, as a pensioner, that Martínez returned to Spain. Hopes that Spain's dictatorship would also topple like its counterparts in Germany and Italy were dashed. The Western powers had no interest in intervening in Spain, and internally Franco's power could not be shaken.
Franco wanted to make sure that on the surface everything was calm and under control, even though appalling things might be being done in various sort of dungeons and cells, in prisons and in police headquarters.
Part of the population stood behind Franco. and the opposition was brutally silenced.
The repression after 1939 was far and away the worst in Spain's entire history. Europe has never seen the level of brutality which followed the Spanish Civil War.
In the Civil War, Marcos Ana was a political commissar on the side of the Republicans. As a result, he spent nearly 23 years in prison. In the attempt to work through his terrible experiences, he began to write.
We were taken to Madrid for sentencing and put in the cellars of the Directorate for Security. You weren't sent there to stay for long, but to be tortured, to point the finger at comrades, to be broken.
The prisons were hopelessly overcrowded, the conditions appalling. Consequently, many inmates were used as forced labor outside the prisons. Others were eliminated by the regime.
They arrested comrades every day, except Saturdays. In their hypocrisy, they didn't want to shoot people on a Sunday. On all other days, however, some of my colleagues saw the sunrise for the last time, and I lived in that hell.
It's estimated that by the end of the Second World War, Franco's regime had executed 200,000 people. Often, the victims were shot without trial. Throughout Spain, nameless victims from the time lay buried anonymously. It was only in 1951 that activists began to open the graves. Since then, some 25,000 corpses have been recovered and identified. Only a fraction of those killed.
One of Franco's most sinister executioners once said, "The left will not stir again for 20 or 30 years." And it didn't.
The atmosphere of terror, the atmosphere of fear was there right from the start, and it was well known, you know, the screams from, say, the Dirección General de Seguridad in the Plaza del Sol in Madrid was enough, if you like, to keep people in the capital well aware of what would happen to them if they actually started to work against the regime.
Units of the Guardia Civil and the secret police kept the Spanish people under total surveillance. The many years of terror left deep marks. Fear became part of everyday life. Many people preferred to stay well away from politics and focused instead on coping with their daily problems. Because the start of the post-war period had seen no change in the disastrous supply situation. A large proportion of the population continued to suffer from hunger and poverty. How could anyone still believe the regime's promises? The isolation policy was clearly making everything even worse. If the situation was to improve, Franco urgently needed international loans, but he was turned down. He was now forced to rely on the help of the few friends he had. Appreciable support came especially from Argentina, where Juan Perón had been president since 1946. Perón, like Franco, a general and fascist sympathizer, granted loans and approved deliveries of grain. This meant that at least the worst of the famine in Spain could be combated. Without Perón's help, the impoverished country could scarcely have survived. As a special gesture of friendship, in 1947, Perón sent his wife Evita to Madrid. The visit by the glamorous 28-year-old was accompanied by many rumors. Franco's wife, Carmen, for instance, is said to have forbidden her husband to travel around Spain alone with Evita.
Franco, although there are doubts about his sexuality, always seemed to have an eye for the ladies. And this was something that his wife was very aware of. So when Evita came, who was very beautiful, apparently there was a a big competition between her and Mrs. Franco.
Spain's First Lady wanted to match the young Argentinian in every way, at least with regard to fashion. On one occasion, apparently despite the summer heat, Franco's wife even wore her finest fur coat. Evita Perón was intended to bring a touch of glamour to destitute Spain and distract its people from their woes.
Evita was a populist. She was more of a fascist in terms of, you know, a populist, modernizing regime and so on. That wasn't Franco. I would be surprised if there was much of a meeting of minds.
Franco was happy for Evita's great popularity to let him too appear in a glittering light. For the dictator, this was the first important state visit after the Civil War. Franco's propaganda made the foreign boycott responsible for Spain's misery. Primarily, however, that misery was homemade. Since 1939, Franco's regime had aspired to self-sufficiency, total independence from other countries. But this policy had led Spain down a dramatic blind alley. In industry and agriculture, there was a shortage of everything.
The way that Franco's propaganda tried to blame an international sort of bloc against it was, of course, trying to make a virtue out of necessity, trying to say that this was sort of ideological and all the rest of it, when in fact the incompetence of the running of the economy was abysmal.
Spain was still an agricultural country. It lacked all the prerequisites for a self-sufficient economy: raw materials, infrastructure, and the necessary expertise. In the early 50s, ambitious prestige projects were launched, which, it was hoped, would change the situation. Franco wanted to bring about an economic revival by force. His favorite project involved dams. During his rule, the Caudillo had several hundred of them constructed all over Spain. Above all, the dams were designed to improve the water supply to Spain's extensive arid regions. Agriculture was particularly dependent on water. Now, new farming colonies were established everywhere. In regions of low productivity, the state distributed land to settlers' families, who were to make the land arable. Soon, nearly 300 of these colonies existed. Águeda del Caudillo in the province of Salamanca is one of the villages which were founded. The settlers saw it as a chance to escape from the misery in Spain.
When we came here, we started virtually from scratch. They gave us seed, and we plowed the soil with donkeys as best we could.
Not everyone knew what to do with the plots, least of all me.
The prospect of a house and a plot of land attracted some 55,000 families from all over Spain to the new colonies. But only those who declared their loyalty to Franco were allowed to settle in them. The more helping hands, the better. So, large families were particularly welcome. It was important to the buffeted regime for the colonization program to be a success. The expectations placed on settlers were high. Good harvests, it was hoped, would finally put an end to the famine. The dictator opened the colonies personally, a special honor for the new farmers.
I thought it was great because there were lots of people there. And then the Generalissimo, you know, Franco, he stood up there and spoke to the people. As a child, of course, that really impressed me. I couldn't believe it. My goodness, what a man.
When it was officially opened in 1954, Like many other colonies, Águeda had del Caudillo added to its name. It was not until 2016 that this reverence to Franco was removed. Political activists had taken the issue to court. Many people in Águeda are still grateful to the dictator even today. They were able to build up a livelihood on a piece of land which Franco had taken away from the big landowners as a supposed benefactor of the poor. Often, though, the soil was barren. Many farmers found it hard to live from the harvest and pay taxes as well. Time and again, settler families had to give up.
We'd already had a vegetable patch, so I knew what I was doing. But what if you've no experience? Many people came from outside and had no idea. They didn't produce anything and had to hand over their land to someone else.
Franco's propaganda sold the colony program as a successful land reform. But in reality, yields were well below expectations. The winners were the wealthy big landowners who still pocketed substantial compensation for land that was worthless. In Spain, social inequality was part of everyday life. Nepotism and corruption ensured that the upper class retained its privileges. While millions starved, the elite wallowed in absolute luxury. Franco's family was no exception. Carmencita, the dictator's daughter, had an extravagant lifestyle, and his siblings were involved in suspect business dealings. Franco himself was not too concerned with luxury. He profited in a different way. By enabling his minions to live off the fat of the land, he ensured their loyalty.
Since he himself was corrupt, he regarded it as perfectly normal for people to be bought off.
Franco's wife is regarded as the central figure in this system. Doña Carmen had a major influence on decisions taken by her husband, and she enjoyed her power to the full.
It is said that whenever she went anywhere, in Spain, she'd go to jewelers' shops and she'd say, oh, that's a nice piece, I like this and whatever. And anyone who claimed that, for the bill to be paid would suddenly find they were subject to tax inspections.
Many decisions in Spain were taken not by institutions, but by individuals with power. So good contacts were helpful.
People's abilities to set up businesses, to import various items, all depended on who you knew within the movement or within the national bureaucracy. I think in Spain, the corruption was so great, particularly at higher levels in the administration, that it was actually making any form of economic development almost impossible.
Other European countries like Germany benefited in their reconstruction from the Marshall Plan. Franco's Spain was denied this help, but other prospects soon presented themselves. The Cold War improved Franco's situation considerably. Since 1947, the countries of the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, and the Western powers, dominated by the United States, had been competing in an arms race. The world was divided into two hostile blocs: socialism versus the free market economy. Europe was at the focal point of the arms race, which soon involved nuclear weapons. With the possibility of a Third World War looming, both sides were busily gathering potential allies. Spain could be a valuable partner in the conflict with the Eastern Bloc, but NATO, the Western alliance, saw no place in its ranks for Franco. reservations regarding the dubious despot were too great. Franco was furious. After all, was it not he who for years had propagated the fight against communism?
Franco reacted with total incomprehension to the attitude by the Western powers. He had been absolutely convinced that he would be accepted into the Western Defensive Alliance.
And indeed, the US government was beginning to think again. Maybe the Nazis' former friend should be included after all.
The Pentagon exerted more and more influence. It spoke a totally different language, pointing out time and again that it was simply impossible for Europe, for the Mediterranean, and for the Straits of Gibraltar to be defended effectively without the participation of Spain.
As the threat of war increased, Spain assumed more and more strategic importance. In the event of a Soviet attack, Spain could be useful as a place of refuge, but also as a bridgehead in Europe. In 1950, the Korean War broke out, making the situation even more critical. In NATO, Washington got its way. Spain was to be given a role in the defense of the West. At the same time, at the United Nations, America advocated Franco's rehabilitation. After 4 years of isolation, Franco was brought in out of the cold.
When the UN lifted its sanctions in 1950, the regime's reaction was to say, they have realized that we were right. The sanctions were unjustified, and Spain did not bow and scrape.
La estrategia occidental precisa una pieza, España. La ONU, por mayoría, acuerda dar libertad para que vuelvan a Madrid los embajadores. Con tal motivo, la televisión americana pide al caudillo unas declaraciones.
Si para el mundo tiene hoy extraordinario valor el que el comunismo no se haya sentado en este extremo occidental de Europa, creo tener derecho a que se corrijan los yerros que con nosotros se cometieron.
The boycott and isolation had ended. Foreign ambassadors returned to Madrid. And the people of Spain waited full of hope for an upswing. And indeed, to a certain extent after 1951, the economic situation improved. The United States approved the first loans to Spain. Then Europe followed suit. Urgently needed investment in industry and agriculture thus became possible. After years of stagnation, the Spanish economy at last had the chance to get going again. And it wasn't only the political situation that was kind to Spain. In 1951, extensive rainfall ended the devastating droughts of previous years. The major famine was over. Spain's farmers gathered in record harvests. Consequently, in 1952, it was possible to end food rationing, earlier than in Great Britain. The improved food supply situation also offered relief to Franco. A nation that is starving can also be a threat to a dictator. With the end of international isolation, his regime had survived its most difficult crisis. But the Western powers were still far from seeing Franco as an equal partner.
The Western democracies never really acknowledged the dictatorship. They didn't want it. They tolerated it. They did business with it. But they told Franco quite clearly, until you respect basic human rights, and until you have a democracy like ours, we do not want you. End of story.
The international community of nations still saw the dictator as nothing more than a necessary evil. So Franco now began to focus more on the power of the Vatican. More than 90% of Spaniards are Catholics, and many of them are devoutly religious. The Catholic Church, and the Vatican in particular, had exercised great influence in Spain for many years. Franco sought a Concordat, a treaty with the Holy See.
On the one hand, this would have a domestic impact. But on the other hand, a Concordat would also make an impression internationally. It would enable Franco's Spain to present itself as a Catholic country within the framework of worldwide Catholicism.
A Concordat would underscore Franco's temporal and religious claim to power. A cunning tactician, he was well aware of the worldwide influence of the Catholic Church.
The important thing was that Franco was seen to go to Mass. I mean, I don't think Franco was remotely religious.
In 1953, a new Concordat was signed between Rome and Spain. The left-wing republic had terminated the old treaty in 1931. In contrast to Franco, the church leaders were in no hurry. Initially, the Vatican was hesitant to bind itself officially to the dictator, but the agreement assured the clergy in Spain of extensive privileges. In return, the dictator tied the bishops to his regime even more closely, and could thus demand their unrestricted loyalty. For many Spaniards, the alliance between state and church was to have far-reaching consequences.
They were given complete control over education, over censorship, and above all over the orphanages. So from that point of view, Franco knew perfectly well that these children would be brainwashed into becoming, you know, basically loyal nationalist Frankist supporters in the future.
Hardly anyone dared say that they were not a Catholic. People were afraid to be different. It was a case of el que dirán. What will people say if I sheer away from official Catholic thinking? In this respect, the Church had a psychological presence, which few were able to breach. Even kissing in public was an offense, escándalo público.
One of the darkest chapters in the cooperation between Church and Franco's regime is the widespread abduction of children. At the time, this was kept a strict secret, but for many years, a network of priests, doctors, and children's homes brought unhappiness to parents and their offspring. The government systematically had children taken away from parents who opposed the fascist regime. In many cases, the parents were in prison, or they had even been murdered. With the help of the Church, their children were to be brought up in homes to become good Christians and followers of Franco. Or they were sold to couples loyal to the regime who wanted a family. The aim was to deprive socialism in Spain of new blood.
The original aspiration was to missionize Spain. In other words, to remove all these demons from the Republic and from Spanish society through intensive mission work, and to create the foundations of a society oriented towards Catholic principles and Catholic dogma. But in the final analysis, this goal proved unattainable.
In the early 50s, the missionary motives gradually faded into the background. By then, the Franco regime had already taken children away from 30,000 women. The organized abduction of children was also a lucrative business. Nurses lied to mothers, telling them that their child had died soon after birth. This deception was necessary because the burial of an infant dying after its first day of life had to be documented. This way, the crime could never come to light. The sinister adoption business even continued until the late 90s, long after the Franco dictatorship had come to an end. It was not until the early years of the new century that the scandal became public. Since then, many Spaniards have been plagued by the question of who their true family is. Pilar Navarro helps the victims of organized child abduction in their search for truth. Her own daughter was stolen from her under the Franco regime.
I gave birth to my child in a private clinic run by the Sisters of Charity. She lay at my breast, but they took her away from me straight away. I was told that she had respiratory problems and needed to be put in an incubator. We were concerned, so our father went down to the incubator to see her. When he asked to see her a second time, a nun told us that the clinic lacked the necessary technology, so they had to transfer the child to another hospital. Less than 24 hours after the birth, they came to us once again to say that our daughter had died. We needn't have any worries, they said, because everything had already been taken care of. She had even been baptized, they claimed. We were so overcome with pain and grief that we never imagined she might not have died, that we should perhaps have questioned what the nuns told us. In many respects, hospitals run by nuns traditionally had the best reputation.
Eficiente, limpio, etcétera, etcétera.
Pilar Navarro is still searching for her daughter. Hospitals and the church brush her off and refuse to provide any information. But she refuses to give up. Indeed, since 2017, Pilar Navarro has also continued her fight through the courts.
The state has given us no help whatsoever. The families affected and the children who were stolen have received no assistance in taking vital steps in their search. The people who committed the crimes are being protected.
But those affected are joining forces. The number of children who were stolen is put at 300,000.
False birth certificates, DNA samples, statements from nurses or from parents who bought children. It is with information of this kind that the Public Prosecutor's Office will be carrying out its investigations. My daughter was taken after 3 days. They stole my twin sister from my parents.
I want to know where I come from and find my mother, who is perhaps looking for me too. Do I have siblings? No idea.
Gene databases could still clear up a lot of cases and bring families together again. But there is only a slim chance that most of those who are guilty can ever be brought to book. Large-scale child abduction, the disquieting end of a totalitarian system with the blessing of the Catholic Church. But the Caudillo sought not only spiritual help, but also solid political support. The Cold War made Franco an important strategic partner. In 1953, the United States and Spain signed a Status of Forces agreement. Franco consented to the establishment of US bases and in return received economic and military aid. The Americans had thus achieved their goal, and without the Spanish dictator becoming a member of NATO. 3 aircraft bases were built. In addition, in Rota in Andalusia, a large naval base was established, the only one in mainland Europe for US submarines armed with nuclear missiles. An 800-kilometer-long pipeline supplied the bases with fuel. In addition, smaller military facilities were set up all over Spain. The US Air Force still uses 2 of the bases today. The The deal with the American armed forces appeared to be good business for Franco. The Generalissimo collected $350 million in military aid in the first 5 years alone. The economic aid he received consisted of food, animal fodder, and artificial fertilizer, as well as raw materials for manufacturing consumer goods. And wherever it proved useful to the Americans, Spain's infrastructure was also improved. Spanish propaganda celebrated the signing of the treaty as a major triumph, and Franco as a far-sighted statesman. But critical voices were also raised.
When objections were being made in Spain in terms of, do we want nuclear-armed American aircraft to be stationed next door to Madrid, all of these kind of objections. Franco instructed the diplomats who were engaged in the negotiations, do whatever is necessary, but get this agreement.
It was not a deal between equals.
Para Franco era vital. No en el plano
Politically, it was important to Franco for survival. But for the Americans, it was a purely military agreement. Naturally, they were well aware of Franco's weak bargaining position and got as much out of it as they could. Franco had made Spain completely available to them.
In the event of a worst-case scenario, Washington would have complete freedom of action on the bases. This was guaranteed by additional clauses, something the regime concealed right to the end. In a Third World War, the deal would have made Spain the target for Soviet nuclear missiles. The dangers of this military cooperation, even in peacetime, became evident in January 1966. In a collision with another aircraft over Palomares in Andalusia, an American B-52 bomber lost 4 hydrogen bombs. None of the bombs exploded, but on impact, 2 released radioactive radiation. 1,400 tons of contaminated earth had to be removed. Traces of this radioactive contamination can still be measured today. It was not until 80 days later that the 4th bomb was salvaged from the sea. The people of Spain were told virtually nothing about the magnitude of the accident. Secretly, however, even the dictator was furious at the clauses in the Status of Forces Agreement. The American services in return were small comfort in view of the immense safety risks for Spain.
On the quiet, Franco would complain. He'd say, the only good thing the Americans have done is bring business for prostitutes.
But the deal with the United States also had a global political dimension. Washington and the Vatican had now signed agreements with Franco. This meant that the victor in the Civil War had at last achieved some international recognition. And in 1959, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower even paid a visit to Franco's dictatorship.
When Eisenhower came to visit, you can see Franco is crying. It's a kind of endorsement of his ambition. Here I am with the greatest man on earth, and I'm his equal.
Franco saw himself in the company of the Western powers.
Well, for the opposition, of course, it was extremely depressing in a way because they had hoped that the regime would simply collapse out of its own incompetence.
Eisenhower's visit was a kind of accolade.
It was of major importance to Franco personally. It finally secured his power position in Spain.
Franco, it seemed, had shed his fascist reputation. But what was the dictator planning for Spain's future? After the Second World War, Franco, an admirer of Adolf Hitler, had to look for new partners. But they had their own specific interest in Spain. The Caudillo's regime adapted to the global situation, and in doing so, came under pressure internally. The dictator had grown old. The question of a successor was an issue he dealt with personally. But the young king, by the grace of Franco, had his own plans for Spain's future. After many years of stagnation, in the 1950s, Spain too experienced an economic upswing, boosted by capital from abroad. Franco's foreign policy successes opened up new perspectives and cemented his grip on power. The dictator ruled like a monarch. The El Pardo, the royal palace, served as a perfect backdrop. Here, self-confident and aloof, Franco took center stage. Much to the annoyance of the Spanish royal house. In the unrest that preceded the Civil War, King Alfonso XIII had gone into exile. Since the king's death, Alfonso's son Juan had laid claim to the throne. From his residence in Portugal, he insisted that Franco keep an old promise and re-establish the monarchy.
Franco never intended to restore the monarchy because it would have diminished his own power. However, to keep the monarchists happy, in 1947, he passed a law which was called the Law of Succession, which declared that Spain was a kingdom, but that it was a kingdom without a king, that would have a regent in the person of Francisco Franco Baramonde.
But Don Juan secured a perspective for his family's future. In 1948, he agreed to send his son, Juan Carlos, to Franco. His own liberal views ruled out Don Juan himself as a successor.
Effectively, what Franco is saying to Don Juan, if you ever want to be on the throne, if you want your family to come back and be on the throne, you let me have your son, and you let me train your son in the ways that I want.
Franco took Juan Carlos under his wing. He received the necessary drill at elite schools and military academies. The prince was a kind of security for the dictator. He protected Franco from any over-hasty claims by the royal house. The Caudillo regarded his own claim to power as incontestable.
Franco saw himself as absolutely essential to the peace of Spain. And like any long-serving dictator, he always felt that as soon as he was gone, there was going to be chaos.
Franco was convinced that the people stood behind him. Thanks to foreign aid, living conditions in Spain had improved. Surely that had to ensure loyalty. But Spanish society was changing. The regime faced new challenges.
The time for a new generation first had to come, and we were that generation, those born during the Civil War. We were not scarred by the reign of terror. We'd not experienced the repression that occurred during the war and afterwards, so we were bolder.
In 1956, the University of Madrid became the first scene of unrest. Its students called for freedom and democracy. In the eyes of the dictator, that was tantamount to patricide, because the demonstrators came from the very upper class he had always favored. The parents were loyal followers of Franco, but their offspring were suddenly protesting.
We wanted democratization, democratic parties and so on. We didn't have any concrete concept. We just wanted a normal democratic country like France, post-war Germany and Italy.
But it was actually the fascist party that held sway at Spain's universities, because Franco also used his phalangists to control the country's academic life. And they shared the Caudillo's mistrust of the universities, which were seen as potential breeding grounds for dangerous left-wing ideas. The student protests in Madrid had to be ended as quickly as possible, if necessary, by force.
The Falange was afraid of the protests gathering momentum, so it occupied the university. When I arrived, it was full of armed Phalangists in uniform. They'd taken over the entire university. We students were sitting in a lecture theatre when the Phalangists suddenly began to pummel us. We put up resistance, and a real battle ensued. Tables and chairs were smashed. We picked up the chair legs and attacked the Phalangists with them. The university was completely taken apart.
The resistance could not be stifled from one day to the next. At the universities, camps once hostile to one another now formed a broad alliance against Franco. The police had been ordered to cut back on torture and political murder. This gave the workers more and more courage to resist. Franco's inflationary policies were having a dramatic impact on ordinary Spanish people. Prices were rising day by day, but wages remained static. In 1956, workers in several industrial centers downed tools. The regime was beginning to feel the anger of the masses. Luis Romero experienced the start of the protests as a farm laborer in Andalusia. Like many others, he hoped to find better working conditions in Barcelona.
In the 1950s, farm laborers gradually began to mobilize. Now everyone wanted to earn at least a certain amount of money, not just for the cash itself, but out of pure necessity. Things moved a lot faster in industry because more labor was needed there. So lots of workers came together. In a factory, it was much easier for us to protest and make demands of all kinds.
But the strikers and demonstrators did not represent all Spaniards. Many were still Franquistas. "20 years of war and despotism had left deep scars. Millions of Spaniards had come to terms with the regime. They did not believe that the dictatorship would end all that quickly.
After Spain signed the agreement with the United States, that was regarded as unlikely. As long as the Americans supported Franco, the regime would not simply embrace democracy, which is what many people in Spain wanted. So they simply focused on everyday life instead of thinking politically.
For many, football was a welcome distraction. In the mid-50s, the international successes of Real Madrid and Barcelona were celebrated frenetically. The emotional experience of sport united the nation, especially as the state had no influence over what happened on the field. Most Spaniards were more interested in their local club than in big politics.
What always fascinated me was that no matter what part of Spain you were in, everyone told you that the most important thing in a man's life was to become president of the local football club.
Franco's propaganda machine quickly realized the potential that presented itself and sought close relations with Spain's top clubs. Their triumphs were to be Franco's triumphs, success in which the Caudillo could bask. Football is popular worldwide, and the dictatorship also used the sport to polish its image abroad.
At the time, you were top dog. You played for Real Madrid. You were league champions. You're the best, they said, the greatest. After all, we represented Real Madrid, and whether you were a foreigner or not, you also represented Spain. Naturally, strict guidelines were laid down as to how we had to behave.
But in the long run, the impressive triumphs on the pitch could not mask the economic problems. Towards the end of the decade, the upswing of the early 50s was followed by the next crisis. Because of Franco's inflationary politics, prices soared. Now it wasn't just the lower classes who faced impending poverty. Half the country was affected. Franco had to get a grip of the supply situation, even if it meant Spain sliding further into debt. The country had to import expensive industrial goods, from Germany, for example. But for its part, Spain had little more to offer than citrus fruits. More and more loans were needed, and sooner or later, the state would be bankrupt.
The regime noticed that it had to do something, not because of the unbridled inflation, but because it had no foreign exchange. It had medium-term debts. We're talking about 5 years. Spain had no way of securing foreign exchange, and there was no alternative. Pursuing self-sufficiency with the Falange was out of the question.
Franco was in deep trouble. If his dictatorship was to survive, he had to allow reforms. In 1957, the dictator took drastic measures and replaced 12 out of 18 ministers. For the first time, he filled cabinet posts not with minions, but with experts.
Franco is 65. It's the time when most people retire. Things have changed. Franco is no longer capable of running such a society. He needs technocrats. He needs technicians who will do the job.
The new ministers had a radical plan. They wanted to open up the Spanish market internationally so that the economy could at last develop. The aim was to improve living standards and thus stifle protest. Many of the reformers belonged to Opus Dei, a lay organization of the Catholic Church, whose members were regarded as particularly secretive. In Spain, Opus Dei was especially powerful. With Franco's indulgence since the early 50s, more and more members of Opus Dei had been occupying key positions in government and society. In its own educational facilities, the Catholic organization trained young people for leadership roles and imparted an elitist conception of the world. Its founder, José Escrivá, had set his sights on Spain's highly educated elite right from the start. This is where he recruited his followers. The aim was for them to occupy key positions and control the state's destiny. Opus Dei gave Franco's conservative Christian course its full support.
There was no question of them having a completely free market, because being Opus Dei, the one thing they did not want to have was anything which was basically anti-regime or anti-Catholic in that particular way, so it was extremely controlled.
The planned reforms were solely of an economic nature. They were designed primarily to maintain the dictatorship. But even so, the pious gentlemen had a lot of trouble convincing Franco of their plan.
It was made plain to him that he could no longer drive in his car because the country had no petrol. The supplies weren't forthcoming. He was also told that as people became increasingly dissatisfied, political unrest would increase. Only then was he prepared to accept economic change, but he never actually supported it.
The driving force behind the reform was a long-standing loyal supporter of Franco, Admiral Carrero Blanco, a Catholic who had paved the way for Opus Dei to enter the regime's leadership circle.
Franco felt that at last he had found somebody who would perpetuate his regime and his idea of total political and social stagnation.
Up to this point, the regime in Spain had been oriented entirely towards its head, the Caudillo Francisco Franco. This made it vulnerable. Carrero's technocrats were now thinking of the future. Who would succeed Franco one day? In their eyes, Prince Juan Carlos was merely one of several candidates. His liberal father, Don Juan, could have a negative influence on the young man. So, Franco too had his doubts about Juan Carlos's loyalty. Could he really trust his protégé? Franco was nearing 70, which fueled speculation about his successor. The dictator's family also drew public attention. When Franco's daughter Carmencita presented the Caudillo with a grandson, the race for the throne again seemed totally open. Franco himself never said a word. He didn't want to rush. Instead, he continued to keep a quiet watch on the candidates. The reformers of Opus Dei knew that the future of the regime also depended on their success. Only an end to the economic hardship would break the people's desire for freedom and their spirit of resistance. But initially, opening up the market only aggravated the crisis. Many found it even harder to feed their family. Once again, the main victims were the workers and small-scale entrepreneurs. Thousands lost their job. Many businesses suddenly became unprofitable and had to close.
So it became clear that something had to be done about these people who had become unemployed and who constituted an unrest factor. And as historical coincidence would have it, this was a time when the rest of Europe was experiencing an economic upswing.
Industry was booming virtually all over Europe, but not on the Iberian Peninsula. The West European economic miracle had passed by Spain. It was in this situation that Franco discovered a new export commodity: labor. The main destination countries for Spanish work immigrants were Switzerland, West Germany, and France. Great Britain and the Benelux countries also accepted guest workers from Spain. In the 1960s, nearly 1.5 million Spaniards left their homeland, a historic peak. At first, West Germany reacted cautiously to inquiries from Franco's state, placing more faith instead in workers from Italy. It was not until the early 80s that the government in Bonn also concluded a labor recruitment agreement with Madrid.
In Köln richteten sich unsere Kameras auf 2 Sonderzüge mit mehr als 1100 spanischen und portugiesischen Gastarbeitern. Wie kein anderes europäisches Industrieland ist die Bundesrepublik mit ihren mehr als 600.000 freien Stellen auf sie angewiesen.
José Beltrán only returned to his Spanish homeland as a pensioner. Today, he looks after the interests of guest workers worldwide. At the age of 25, Beltrán left Madrid for Oberhausen.
I left to see a different world and to have more opportunities. Here I was badly off. I'd never have been able to own a car. I had no money, and there were no cars anyway.
In 1962, he quickly settled in with a German family. But many of his colleagues regarded their time abroad merely as a temporary phase in their lives, just a brief stay.
Most of them came from villages in the Extremadura or Andalusia. They were good, hard-working people who led simple lives. They wanted to return to Spain quickly with the money they had saved, because they'd left their families and their children behind. That was tough.
Most of the guest workers had hardly any contact with German society. Nevertheless, life in a democracy was a defining experience.
Back then, it was mainly young people who left to work abroad. They had absolutely no idea about politics. But in France or in Germany, they experienced a totally different reality. There were trade unions and political parties. They became members of the CGT, for instance. They experienced freedom and trained as activists. Then they returned to Spain and often played an important role in the workers' struggle. Their politicization had taken place in Germany, Switzerland, or France.
The money from guest workers was extremely welcome in Franco's Spain. But their experience of the freedoms of the West could prove dangerous. Franco placed his faith in patriotism.
Quiero hacer llegar mi voz con la felicitación y los votos de la patria a los españoles más alejados, a los dispersos por el mundo, a los trabajadores que persiguiendo un bienestar mayor trabajan fuera de la nación, con la promesa para todos de seguir forjando la patria grande que, corrigiendo injusticias, derrame sus bienes sobre todos los españoles. Para todos, el abrazo de la patria y el mío personal.
In order to bind the guest workers to their homeland, holiday trips to Spain were offered, along with lots of small presents.
The Spanish government sent show groups, on Christmas Eve, for example, to places in Germany where lots of Spanish people lived. It was like a small Spanish celebration. They did it to ingratiate themselves with the Spanish guest workers, who sent a lot of money home, and in doing so helped Spain out of its economic crisis.
In the 1960s alone, guest workers sent the equivalent of 26.5 billion euros back to Spain. Fresh capital and a breath of fresh air. The end of protectionism at last paid off. Spain received more loans from abroad and also achieved greater revenues itself. Tourism especially brought in foreign exchange. Summer after summer since the late 50s, more and more foreigners had been spending their holidays on Spain's beaches. Tourism had become far and away the most important growth sector. Back then, many Germans discovered Mallorca, which soon became their favorite island. Former tour guide Hans Birkhäuser experienced the early days as Mallorca developed into a holiday paradise with dubious experts from abroad.
When I came to Mallorca for the first time in 1956, I was amazed to hear not Spanish, English or French being spoken, but Flemish. According to what my colleagues told me, those speaking Flemish must have been former soldiers of the Flanders SS division. A few of them who had fled to Spain in good time before the end of the war had opened an agency which functioned so efficiently and reliably that the Spaniards could only learn from it.
For many, holidaying in a dictatorship was not a problem.
Back then, it was the Minister of Tourism, Fraga Iribarne, who coined the famous slogan, España es diferente. Spain is different. He wanted to revive the romantic cliché, but the slogan also had a political connotation. We are different in every way. We also have a different political system. But if you come to us, that is something you will have to accept.
But the many bikini-clad girls full of the joys of life also constituted a threat. While economic reformers were attracting more and more tourists to the country, the regime feared the decline of traditional values.
He was extremely uneasy about what effect this would have on Spanish youth. The idea that other people could travel, the pop music that was coming in, the clothing and all the rest of it, all of this completely undermined, in his view, the basis of what Spanish society should be.
Franco and the church did not want any Western-style decline in moral standards, so surveillance was called for.
You often saw the Guardia Civil. You would recognize them by their conspicuous tricornio hats. When I first came, they kept a close eye on what was happening on the beaches. Back then, kissing and cuddling and so on was seen as unacceptable. As time passed, though, things changed. I saw for myself how, as the number of tourists increased, the Guardia Civil turned a blind eye more and more and didn't really bother.
Tourists were into sun and fun. Hardly anyone was interested in Franco's prisons.
Jeder zweite deutsche Flugtourist hat oder hatte in diesem Sommer ein Ticket für Mallorca in der Tasche. An manchen Tagen bringen annähernd 100 Charter- oder Linienmaschinen 10.000 Touristen auf die Sonneninsel.
Thanks to inexpensive package offers, more and more holidaymakers could afford to fly to the Mediterranean. By 1960, the annual number of tourists had already reached 6 million. And the boom continued. With hotel capacities on the Mediterranean stretched, the government had to react. The following year broke all records. By 1975, the number of tourists had increased fivefold to 30 million a year. In view of this bonanza, by and large, Franco gave tourism free rein. This resulted in the uncontrolled construction of ugly giant hotels. Many Spanish people were far from happy at their coasts being concreted over. But the tourist invasion also played a major role in getting the impoverished country back on its feet.
The Spanish economy now grew in a way that was unique in the 20th century. Back then, an average economic growth rate of around 7% was achieved, one of the highest worldwide.
The Spanish economic miracle had finally arrived. On the roads, the Seat 600 became the symbol of the boom. After years of deprivation, the people were able to breathe a sigh of relief. We've made it.
Living standards were rising. I mean, huge building projects took place of very low quality, but people no longer, as in the South, lived in caves, they lived in apartments. Of course, the Franco regime gave all the credit to Franco. This is the benevolent grandfather of his people making Spaniards happy.
The fact that Franco had been against economic openness had long been forgotten. The state media celebrated him and the boom. Had the men of Opus Dei achieved their goal? Had growing prosperity muffled criticism of the regime. Either way, the aged despot felt untouchable. Now, more and more, Franco was leaving the drudgery of day-to-day politics to his ministers. First and foremost, to Luis Carrero Blanco. As vice president, he had actually been ruling the country since 1967.
From that point on, Franco becomes a symbolic head of state. You know, all he does, he obviously spends a lot of time hunting, a lot of time fishing, huge amount of time watching TV. He has 17 televisions.
Spanish propaganda kept secret about Franco's excessive TV consumption. Instead, it portrayed his success at hunting and fishing. The grey-haired Caudillo was now over 70, and he liked himself more and more in the role of grandfather of the nation. But the facade was crumbling. Many Spaniards could no longer be kept quiet with bread and games, nor through fear of state power. The model of flourishing democracies abroad stirred the desire for freedom more and more. The aging dictator was gradually losing control. Spanish society was changing. Young people in particular were protesting. Now, it wasn't only economic, but also political reforms they wanted. In the mid-60s, resistance to Franco's regime became more radical. Spain's youth was losing patience. People took to the streets nearly every day. Since the first riots in the mid-50s, protests had never really abated. It was only 10 years later, however, that they developed into a mass movement.
At the time, it even encouraged older people to participate and become organized. Many separate organizations emerged. There were citizens' initiatives, as well as political parties covering a wide range of ideologies. In this respect, our fight became visible.
The radical actions of the ETA found particular attention. The Basque underground organization had been fighting for years for more self-determination, something Franco had always denied Catalans and Basques. In 1967, ETA carried out its first bomb attacks. They were followed soon after by political murders.
ETA, at that particular stage, had a greater logic to it than, of course, it had once democracy arrived. So I don't think people necessarily sympathized with it, but they perhaps had, certainly if they were very much anti-Frankist, they certainly probably had quite a bit more admiration.
Trade unions were still banned, but the workers were becoming more of a force. Now it was no longer about pure survival. Their protests had become more political, and their goals were more ambitious. The workers' movement gradually developed into the most dangerous form of opposition to Franco. In working-class circles, even the clergy was turning against the regime. Worker priests had long supported strikers, and now bishops were openly criticizing the dictatorship. The fronts were becoming entrenched. Franco even resorted to having priests arrested. But annoying the church was something the dictator could ill afford. Criticism and protests were now coming from all sides. Franco desperately tried to get the people behind him.
Esta batalla por la paz nuestra, la que disfrutamos en el seno de nuestros hogares, es responsabilidad de todos y de cada uno de los españoles. La fidelidad permanente a estos ideales constituye nuestra interna fortaleza y no debéis tolerar nunca que nadie, ni fuera ni dentro, trate de destruirlos.
By now, though, conjuring up the old spectres and conspiracy theories only had an impact on inveterate supporters of the dictator. In Spain, one question was becoming more and more pressing. Who will succeed Francisco Franco? Franco purposely delayed naming a successor in order to restrain the vultures hovering inside and outside his government. Defiantly, he pointed out the longevity of his forefathers. Then, in July 1969, came the long-awaited address. For more than 20 years, the country had speculated about various candidates. Now, the Caudillo unveiled his secret and named Juan Carlos as the successor to his throne.
He decidido proponerle a la patria como mi sucesor.
Spain breathed a sigh of relief.
Juan Carlos is king only because Franco has named him. So Franco has broken the legitimacy of the royal line. He's broken the continuity of the royal line. And effectively what he's doing, he is showing that he is greater than any king.
31-year-old Juan Carlos pledged absolute loyalty to the head of state. The new title, Prince of Spain, was created for this descendant of the Bourbon kings.
Juan Carlos, who played his cards very, very carefully, again, in a slightly Frankist way of not really revealing what his true feelings were, and so therefore gave Franco the encouragement to believe that he could actually carry things on in the future.
The regime continued to keep a close eye on Juan Carlos.
Close advisors, and particularly the group that gathers around Mrs. Franco, that want to make sure that there will be no move to democratization, say to Franco, and this happens, we've a lot of evidence about this, say to Franco, be careful with this Juan Carlos. He's not to be trusted.
Franco's wife, Carmen Polo, was regarded as the center of the widespread nepotism. She and the Franco family's favorites were afraid of losing their privileges. Franco believed that he had young Juan Carlos under control because he had placed Luis Carrero as the head of government at the prince's side. The experienced hardliner was now also officially responsible for day-to-day political business and totally endorsed Francoism. Franco was convinced that his political heritage was secured, even though the regime was clearly unable to find any solution to the problems it was facing. The dictator was not prepared to introduce any democratic reforms. He again placed his faith more in the old methods, terror and violence.
Often a demonstration consisted solely of us quickly shouting a few slogans in the street and then beating a hasty retreat. Because 2 seconds later, the police were there and opened fire, and they shot to kill. The most important thing was to say nothing if we were arrested. We had to remain steadfast in order to protect our comrades.
Felisa and her fellow campaigners were repeatedly arrested and tortured for days on end. In the rest of Europe, the '68 generation was cheerfully embarking on a new beginning. But in Spain, people continued to disappear without trace.
Ich habe in dieser Zeit, die ich noch Franco leben.
During the time when Franco was in power, I often learnt that friends and relatives of players had been abducted or had disappeared.
Oder bekannten Freunden irgendwelche Spieler bei uns zusammenhingen. Wir hatten ja
Because we had players from all over Spain.
Und egal wo einer herkam.
Things like that happened everywhere.
Überall ist irgendwas passiert in der Richtung.
Information from the regime's torture chambers leaked out more and more often. One turning point was the Burgos trial in 1970. 16 ETA fighters stood before a military tribunal. They faced the death penalty. This triggered a wave of protests, not only abroad, but also in Spain itself.
Der Prozess von Burgos wirkt sich aus wie ein Katalysator, den sich die Unzufriedenheit kristallisiert, mit der zahllose Spanier, die bisher keineswegs zur Opposition gerechnet werden mussten, die Regierungspolitik der letzten 1,5 Jahre verfolgen.
How much longer could the dictatorship survive?
The Pyrenees weren't 3,000 meters high, as they are in reality. They were 10,000 meters high. What happened beyond them was always the same. In this respect, Iberia was somewhat despised. Franco was always in power. But the trial in Burgos in 1970 brought the whole issue to the world's attention for the first time.
The verdict sparked off worldwide protests. All the accused had been sentenced to death. Franco's violent regime wanted to set an example. But international pressure grew. Even the Pope intervened. A few days later, the Caudillo relented and commuted the death sentences. To save the dictator's face, his propaganda machine sold Franco's decision as an act of strength. As an exception, he had shown leniency.
On a social level, that was quite successful, and it motivated us to see what else we could achieve.
The opposition believed its time had come. Franco's health was visibly fading. He was suffering from Parkinson's disease. His fragility was now almost impossible to conceal. Franco's followers had taken every measure to enable the regime to survive his death.
Respecto a la sucesión a la jefatura del Estado, sobre la que tantas maliciosas especulaciones hicieron quienes dudaron de la continuidad de nuestro movimiento, todo ha quedado atado y bien atado.
But on a December morning in 1973, Franco's plans were shattered. His faithful vice president, Admiral Carrero Blanco, was assassinated by ETA. On his way back from church, a bomb was detonated, which hurled his car high into the air.
People were afraid. What is going to happen next? What I remember is the sudden silence in the city. Everybody withdrew and waited, because something like that had been totally unexpected.
The dictator was heart-stricken and grieved for his veteran companion.
The assassination, I think, probably sort of hastened Franco's death in a way, in a longer term, because I think Franco then started to give up slightly. He realized that sort of things probably weren't going to be quite the same after his death.
The power vacuum created by the assassination had to be filled quickly. Franco's wife took control. Ever since their young days, Carmen Polo had been seen as the driving force behind her husband. He rarely took a decision against her will.
A name would come up and Franco would say, who's that? And she'd say, oh, for God's sake, Paco, he's the man we made foreign minister. So there is no doubt that she had an immense influence over him.
Carmen Polo picked up where the assassinated Carrero Blanco had left off. Her government team guaranteed a tough line, even after Franco's death. With her help, the ultra-conservatives won the internal struggle. Violence against critics of the regime assumed extreme forms. Nevertheless, to the persecuted, a new political dawn seemed within reach. Franco played golf In 1974, dictatorships ended in 2 other countries, Portugal and Greece. But no reaction was forthcoming from Spain's dictator. No reforms, no abdication.
He played golf. At least once a day, he would wave down from his balcony and greet someone. He was always present to lull people, and in this way, to gain time. He never considered stepping down or making any significant changes. That gave many people who were depoliticized some peace of mind. Nothing else will happen. Everything will continue as before. At the same time, however, when his illness became manifest, a big question mark arose. People knew something would happen soon, but they didn't know what.
Many people were worried. Would Franco's death open up the old wounds of the Civil War? After all, Spain was still divided into camps, deeply hostile to one another.
There's a total difference between those who are the supporters, who are obviously frightened about what's going to happen when Franco is out of the way, and all of those who are longing for the old bastard to die.
On the 39th anniversary of its assumption of power, the regime mobilized the masses once again. This great gesture of national solidarity was also designed to intimidate the regime's critics. For over 40 years, the victor of the Civil War had placed his faith in such orchestrations time and again.
He didn't have an alternative. He couldn't introduce reforms that would have met the needs of Spanish society. That would have been tantamount to negating the political work of a lifetime. And for Franco, that was out of the question.
A few weeks later, Franco suffered the first of several heart attacks. The general public followed his slow death practically live. Doctors kept him artificially alive for several weeks, until November the 20th, 1975.
Españoles, Franco ha muerto.
Half a million Spaniards paid their final respects to the Caudillo. His mortal remains were laid to rest in the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. Franco had had the mausoleum built for himself many years before. Spain and the rest of the world held its breath. What would happen now? Would the dictatorship also die along with Franco? Only 2 days after Franco's death, Juan Carlos was sworn in as the Spanish king and head of state. His most important mission was to find a future for Spain and its divided society. Juan Carlos would soon veer from the path laid down by his patron. Reforms were inevitable, but the pressing questions were, how far-reaching would they be? And how strong was the young king on whom all hopes rested? In appointing Adolfo Suárez as the Prime Minister, Juan Carlos took an important figure on board. Suárez was a former Franco supporter. Now, together with the king, step by step, he wanted to tread the path to a modern democracy. In summer 1974, free elections were held in Spain for the first time in 40 years. And an amnesty law was passed granting impunity for those who had committed crimes during the Civil War and under the Francoist regime. Then, on February the 23rd, 1981, Spain's future suddenly hung by a thread. Right-wing paramilitaries from the army and the Guardia Civil took over parliament in an attempted coup. But in the same night, the king endorsed the democratically elected government. He gave a clear rebuff to the rebels and Franco's political heritage. Some people had had little faith in Juan Carlos, but at that moment, he had saved democracy in his country.
The Spaniards, on the whole, didn't really want to go back to the Spanish Civil War. They wanted to fast forward into the future. And Spain's regeneration, Spain's modernization in such a short space of time, particularly in the 1980s, was an amazing achievement.
Under Francisco Franco, Spain had experienced the most difficult epoch in its recent history. The Civil War cost 500,000 lives. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands more became victims of a reign of terror. Almost 40 years of Franco's dictatorship have left deep scars. Many of the guilty remain silent, while those who suffered are rarely listened to. Reconciliation remains a task for the present and the future.